Welcome back to Crime Stories for Sleep. Tonight we descend deeper into the archives, where police reports rest in perfect rows, their pages holding the careful details of lives intersected by law. Let your breathing slow as we explore not the crimes themselves, but the gentle rhythm of how they were recorded, documented, preserved in the eternal stillness of official language. The typewriter in room 12 of the Central Precinct had been clicking steadily since 2 a.m. Its mechanical rhythm creating a kind of meditation for Officer Patricia Wells as she worked through the stack of incident reports that had accumulated during her shift. Each form required the same careful attention to detail, the same precise language that transformed the chaos of human conflict into something that could be filed, referenced, and understood by others who had not witnessed the original events. Officer Wells had perfected the art of report writing over her 8 years with the department. Her fingers moved across the keys with practiced efficiency, translating the notes she had taken during interviews and observations into the formal language that police reports required. There was something deeply satisfying about this process, the way raw experience could be shaped into clear, factual narratives that would serve as permanent records of temporary disruptions in the Fayoum city's daily life. The first report on her desk concerned a breaking and entering call she had responded to earlier that evening. Mrs. Catherine Foster, age 64, had returned from visiting her sister to find her front door standing open and several items missing from her living room. The report form waited patiently as Officer Wells gathered her thoughts, organizing the details of the incident into the sequence that would best serve anyone who might need to understand what had occurred. She began with the basic information that every report required: the date, time, and location of the incident, the names and addresses of all parties involved, the classification code that would allow the report to be properly filed and cross-referenced. These preliminary details might have seemed mundane to an outside observer, but Officer Wells understood their importance in the larger system of documentation that allowed the police department to track patterns, allocate resources, and maintain the careful records that served as the foundation of law enforcement. The narrative section of the report required more careful consideration. Officer Wells needed to describe not just what had happened, but how she had discovered what had happened, the sequence of observations and interviews that had allowed her to construct a coherent account of the incident. This was where the art of police report writing revealed itself, in the ability to present information in a way that was both accurate and accessible, detailed enough to be useful, but clear enough to be understood by anyone who might need to reference the report months or years later. Mrs. Foster had been visibly shaken when Ada VG's referenced the shaken when years later. Mrs. Foster had been visibly shaken when PDOGD shaken when Officer Wells arrived at her home, sitting on her front porch with her purse clutched tightly in her lap, reluctant to enter the house until she knew it was safe. Officer Wells had conducted a thorough search of the residence, checking each room methodically before inviting Mrs. Foster inside to assess what might be missing. The process had taken nearly an hour, with Mrs. Foster moving slowly through her home, noting the absence of items that had been part of her daily landscape for years. The stolen items formed an unusual pattern that Officer Wells documented carefully in her report. The intruder had taken Mrs. Foster's television and radio, standard targets for most burglaries, but had also removed a collection of ceramic figurines from the mantelpiece and several photographs from the hallway. More puzzling, the intruder had ignored more valuable items, including Mrs. Foster's jewelry box and a small safe that sat openly on her bedroom dresser. Wells had spent considerable time with Mrs. Foster, not just documenting the missing items, but helping her understand the process that would follow. She had explained how the investigation would proceed, what resources were available to help secure the damaged door, and what steps Mrs. Foster could take to make her home more secure in the future. These conversations rarely appeared in official reports, but they represented a crucial part of police work. The human connection that helped victims process their experience and regain their sense of safety. The report form provided specific spaces for different types of information, a structure that had evolved over decades of police work to capture the most important details in the most efficient way possible. Officer Wells filled each section with care, knowing that her words would become the official record of Mrs. Foster's experience, the document that detectives would consult if the case developed leads, the reference that insurance companies would use to process claims. She noted the condition of the front door, which showed signs of having been forced with a prying tool, probably a screwdriver or small crowbar. She documented the absence of any signs of struggle inside the house, suggesting that the intruder had worked quickly and had not been interrupted. She recorded Mrs. Foster's statement that she had last checked the lock at approximately 3 p.m., providing a window of time when the break-in must have occurred. The report also included Officer Wells's observations about the neighborhood context, details that might prove important if this incident was part of a larger pattern. She noted that Mrs. Foster's house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, with thick hedges that provided privacy, but also concealment for anyone approaching the front door. She documented the fact that most of Mrs. Foster's neighbors worked during the day, leaving the street largely deserted during the hours when the break-in had occurred. These environmental details represented one of the most important aspects of police report writing, the ability to see individual incidents within their larger context. Officer Wells understood that crimes rarely occurred in isolation, that patterns emerged over time and geography in ways that could only be detected through careful documentation of seemingly minor details. Her report would be filed alongside hundreds of others, creating a database of information that could reveal connections invisible to anyone. Examining a single incident after completing Mrs. Foster's report, Officer Wells turned to the next incident on her stack, a vandalism case from earlier in her shift. Someone had spray-painted graffiti on the side of Peterson's hardware store, covering a section of brick wall with elaborate designs that seemed to incorporate both letters and abstract shapes. The store owner, Mr. Peterson, had discovered the vandalism when he arrived to open the store at 7 a.m. and had called police immediately. This type of report required a different approach, focusing less on the interaction with victims and more on the physical evidence that might help identify the perpetrator. Officer Wells had photographed the graffiti from multiple angles, documenting not just the overall design, but specific details that might help identify the artist's technique or materials. She had also canvassed the area for additional evidence, checking nearby dumpsters for discarded spray paint cans and examining the pavement for footprints or other traces of the vandal's presence. The graffiti itself was unusual enough to warrant detailed description in the report, rather than the simple tags or profanity that characterized most vandalism. This work showed considerable artistic skill and planning. The designs incorporated the existing texture of the brick wall, using the mortar lines as part of the overall composition. The color scheme was limited to blue and silver, creating effects that seemed to make the flat wall surface appear three-dimensional. Officer Wells had interviewed several business owners in the area, documenting their statements about when they had last noticed the wall in its original condition. The manager of the coffee shop next door had seen the wall at closing time the previous evening and was certain it had been unmarked. The owner of the bookstore across the street had noticed someone working near the hardware store around 2 a.m. but had assumed it was an employee doing maintenance. Work.b's interview details filled several sections of the vandalism report, creating a timeline that would help investigators understand when and how the graffiti had been created. Officer Wells had also documented the store owner's estimate of the cost to remove or paint over the vandalism, information that would be necessary if the perpetrator was eventually identified and prosecuted. Report writing process required Officer Wells to consider not just what had happened, but how her documentation might be used by others in the future. Detectives might use her observations to identify patterns connecting this incident to other vandalism cases. Prosecutors might rely on her interviews to establish the timeline of events if the case went to trial. Insurance adjusters might reference her damage estimates to process claims. This awareness of the report's multiple audiences influenced every decision Officer Wells made about what details to include and how to present them. She had learned to write with precision and clarity, avoiding jargon or assumptions that might confuse readers who lacked police training. She had developed the ability to organize information logically, presenting facts in sequences that built understanding rather than simply listing observations in the order she had made them. The third report in her stack dealt with a domestic disturbance call that had required careful handling and even more careful documentation. Officer Wells had been dispatched to the Rodriguez apartment on Maple Street, where neighbors had reported loud arguing and what sounded like furniture being moved or thrown. These calls always required delicate attention, involving as they did the complex dynamics of family relationships and the challenge of determining when police intervention was necessary and appropriate. Upon arrival, Officer Wells had found Miguel Rodriguez, age 32, and his wife Carmen, age 29, in their living room with their two young children. The apartment showed signs of the disturbance that neighbors had reported, with chairs overturned and books scattered on the floor. But there were no signs of physical violence, and both adults denied that any assault had occurred. The report of this incident required Officer Wells to document not just the physical evidence she had observed, but the complex interpersonal dynamics she had encountered. Miguel Rodriguez had been clearly intoxicated, though cooperative and non-threatening in his interactions with police. Carmen Rodriguez had been upset, but focused primarily on protecting her children from further exposure to conflict. Both parents had been concerned about their neighbors' reactions and the possibility that Child Protective Services might become involved. Officer Wells had spent nearly 2 hours at the Rodriguez apartment, working to understand the situation and help the family develop strategies for preventing future incidents that might require police intervention. Her report documented this process with careful attention to the balance between family privacy and community safety that characterized much of police work involving domestic situations. The formal language of the report could not fully capture the emotional complexity of the situation, but Officer Wells had learned to embed important nuances within the official terminology that police reports required. She noted that both parties had been willing to discuss their problems openly and had shown genuine concern for their children's welfare. She documented Miguel Rodriguez's willingness to seek help for his drinking problem and Carmen Rodriguez's statement that this had been an isolated incident rather than part of an ongoing pattern of conflict. These details might seem minor to lighter to someone unfamiliar with domestic violence cases, but Officer Wells understood their significance for anyone who might need to assess the family situation in the future. Her careful documentation provided context that could help social workers, family court judges, or other police officers make informed decisions about how best to support the Rodriguez family while protecting the children's safety. The report also included information about resources Officer Wells had provided to the family, including referrals to counseling services and support groups that might help them address the underlying problems that had led to the disturbance. She had given Carmen Rodriguez her card and encouraged her to call if future incidents occurred, emphasizing that asking for help was a sign of strength rather than failure. As she worked through the stack of reports, Officer Wells found herself reflecting on the evolution of police documentation over the years she had been with the department. The basic forms had changed little, but the approach to completing them had become more sophisticated, more attuned to the complex social dynamics that created most of the situations police were called to address. Earlier in her career, Officer Wells had focused primarily on the immediate facts of each incident, treating report writing as a simple matter of recording what she had observed and what actions she had taken. Over time, she had come to understand that effective reports needed to capture not just events, but context, not just actions, but motivations, not just what had happened, but why it mattered for understanding the larger patterns of community life. This deeper approach to documentation had made her a more effective officer, she believed, forcing her to pay closer attention to the social and economic factors that shaped the incidents she was called to investigate. Writing detailed reports had taught her to see connections between seemingly unrelated cases, to recognize patterns that might not be apparent to someone examining individual incidents in isolation. The fourth report on her desk involved a shoplifting incident at Morrison's department store, where 17-year-old Jessica Chun had been caught attempting to leave with a sweater she had not paid for. The store's security guard had detained her until police arrived, following standard procedures for handling theft cases involving minors. This type of report required Officer Wells to balance several competing considerations: the store's right to protect its merchandise, the young person's need for fair treatment, and the community's interest in both deterring theft and providing appropriate consequences for first-time offenders. Her documentation would need to provide clear evidence of what had occurred while also capturing the circumstances that might influence how the case was ultimately resolved. Jessica Chun had been cooperative and clearly frightened when Officer Wells arrived at the store. She had immediately admitted to taking the sweater and had expressed genuine remorse for her actions. During their conversation, she had revealed that she had been under pressure from friends to prove she was willing to take risks and had chosen shoplifting as a way to demonstrate her courage without considering the potential consequences. Officer Wells had documented this conversation carefully, understanding that Jessica's motivations and attitude would be important factors in determining how the case proceeded through the juvenile justice system. She had also interviewed the security guard who had witnessed the theft, documenting his observations about Jessica's behavior and ensuring that the evidence would meet the standards required for prosecution if the store chose to press charges. The report included details about Jessica's background that had emerged during their conversation. She was a junior in high school with no previous criminal record, living with her grandmother while her parents worked overseas. Her academic performance had been declining recently, and she had been associating with a group of students who were known to school administrators as potential troublemakers. These contextual details might not have been directly relevant to the immediate charge of shoplifting, but Officer Wells understood their importance for anyone who might be making decisions about Jessica's future. Juvenile court judges often considered family circumstances, academic performance, and peer influences when determining appropriate consequences for young offenders. Officer Wells had also documented her conversation with the store manager about the incident, including his willingness to participate in a diversionary program that would allow Jessica to perform community service in lieu of formal prosecution. This type of alternative resolution had become more common in cases involving first-time juvenile offenders, reflecting a growing understanding that the goal of the justice system should be rehabilitation rather than punishment alone. The report writing process for juvenile cases required special attention to confidentiality requirements and the different legal standards that applied to minors. Officer Wells had completed additional forms that would ensure Jessica's records remained sealed and that her case was handled through the juvenile system rather than adult court. These procedural details might seem technical, but they represented important protections for young people who made mistakes that might otherwise follow them into adulthood. As the night progressed, Officer Wells continued working through her stack of reports, each one representing a different aspect of the community life she had sworn to protect and serve. A noise complaint from an apartment complex had required her to mediate between neighbors with different schedules and different tolerance levels for music and conversation. A minor traffic accident had involved documenting vehicle damage and ensuring that both drivers had exchanged appropriate insurance information. Each report required the same careful attention to detail, the same precision in language, the same consideration of how the documentation might be used by others in the future. Officer Wells had developed a rhythm for this work, a systematic approach that ensured she captured all the necessary information while maintaining the clarity and objectivity that made police reports valuable as both legal documents and historical records. The process of transforming her handwritten notes into formal reports often revealed details she had not fully appreciated during the original incidents. The act of organizing information chronologically and categorically forced her to consider relationships between different aspects of each case, sometimes leading to insights that had not been apparent during her initial investigations. This reflective aspect of report writing had become one of Officer Wells's favorite parts of her job. The quiet hours when she could review her work and consider how each incident fit into the larger patterns of community life. The typewriter's steady rhythm provided a meditative backdrop for this process, creating a space for the kind of careful thinking that effective police work required. The department's filing system would ensure that each of her reports found its proper place in the vast archive of documentation that recorded the city's ongoing efforts to maintain order and safety. Future investigators might reference her work when examining patterns of criminal activity. Researchers might use her observations to understand social trends and community dynamics. Her careful words would become part of the permanent record of how a community had chosen to address the challenges that arose from bringing diverse people together in a shared space. Officer Wells understood that her role in creating this archive carried significant responsibility. The words she chose, the details she included or excluded, the perspective she brought to each incident would influence how these events were remembered and understood by future readers. This awareness motivated her to approach each report with care and thoroughness, treating the documentation process as seriously as she treated the original investigations. The clock on the wall showed 4:15 a.m. as Officer Wells inserted a fresh sheet of paper into her typewriter and began work on her final report of the shift. This one involved a missing person case that had been resolved successfully. An elderly man with early-stage dementia who had wandered away from his assisted living facility and been found several hours later sitting peacefully in the park where he had proposed to his wife 47 years earlier. The resolution of this case had been heartwarming, but the report required the same careful documentation as any other incident. Officer Wells needed to record the timeline of the search, the resources that had been deployed to locate the missing man, and the circumstances of his discovery. She also needed to document the conversations that had led to changes in the assisted living facility's procedures for monitoring residents who might be at risk for wandering. This type of follow-up documentation represented one of the most important aspects of police report writing. The way that individual incidents could lead to systemic improvements that prevented similar problems in the future. Officer Wells's careful records would help the facility's administrators understand what had happened and why, providing the information they needed to implement better safety protocols. As she completed the final report of her shift, Officer Wells felt the satisfaction that came from transforming a night's worth of complex human interactions into clear, organized documentation that would serve the community long after the original incidents had faded from immediate memory. The stack of completed reports represented hours of careful work, each page contributing to the vast archive of experience that allowed law enforcement agencies to learn from the past and prepare for the future. The typewriter fell silent as Officer Wells pulled the final report from the machine and added it to her completed stack. The quiet of the early morning settled over room 12, broken only by the distant sounds of the city waking up to another day. Somewhere in that awakening city, new incidents were already occurring that would require the same careful attention. The same thoughtful documentation, the same commitment to transforming chaos into understanding that had characterized police work for generations. The reports would be filed according to the department's careful system, taking their places among thousands of others in the archives that recorded the ongoing effort to maintain community safety and order. Each page represented not just a record of what had happened, but a testament to the patience, professionalism, and care that officers like Wells brought to the often challenging work of serving and protecting the public. In the growing light of dawn, the completed reports waited quietly for their journey into the permanent archives, where they would join the countless other documents that recorded the daily work of keeping the community safe. One carefully documented incident at a time, the archives beneath the central records division extended far beyond what most people realized. A labyrinth of corridors that had been excavated and expanded over the decades as the city's collection of case files grew beyond the capacity of any single storage room. Archivist Margaret Thompson had been the keeper of these records for 23 years, long enough to remember when some of the oldest sections had still been accessible to regular foot traffic, before they had been sealed off and relegated to the deepest levels of the building. On this particular evening, Margaret moved through the corridors with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent decades learning the geography of organized memory. Her soft-soled shoes made no sound on the polished concrete floors, and her small flashlight created a moving circle of illumination that revealed row after row of filing cabinets, each one labeled with dates and case numbers that stretched back to the earliest days of the police department's existence. The temperature in these deep archives remained constant year-round, maintained by a climate control system that protected the thousands of documents from the humidity and temperature fluctuations that could destroy paper over time. The air carried the faint scent of aged paper and metal, a distinctive aroma that Margaret had come to associate with the preservation of history. There was something deeply satisfying about this environment. This ordered silence where the chaos of human conflict had been transformed into neat rows of documentation. Margaret's destination tonight was Section 7G, a collection of files from the late 1970s that had been scheduled for digitization as part of the department's ongoing effort to preserve older records in electronic format. The process was painstaking, requiring each document to be carefully examined, scanned at high resolution, and then returned to its proper place in the physical archives. Margaret approached this work with the reverence of a scholar handling ancient manuscripts, understanding that these files represented irreplaceable records of the community's history. The section contained cases from 1978 and 1979, a period that Margaret remembered as particularly turbulent for the city. Economic recession had created social tensions that manifested in various forms of crime and civil unrest, while changes in police procedures and legal standards had created challenges for officers who were still adapting to new approaches to law enforcement. The files from this era reflected these broader social dynamics, documenting not just individual crimes, but the larger context in which they had occurred. Margaret selected a cabinet from the middle of the section, one that contained cases from the summer of 1979. The drawer opened smoothly, revealing manila folders that had been arranged in perfect chronological order. Each folder bore the careful labeling that earlier archivists had applied, written in the clear handwriting that had been standard before the widespread adoption of typewriters for all police documentation. First file she pulled contained records of a missing person case that had captured significant public attention during its time but had since faded into the background of the city's collective memory. 16-year-old David O'Connor had disappeared from his family's home on a humid July evening, leaving behind no note or indication of where he might have gone. The initial police report, filed by his frantic parents, painted a picture of a typical suburban teenager who had shown no previous signs of planning to run away. The investigating officer Detective Raymond Walsh had approached the case with the methodical thoroughness that characterized police work of that era. His reports documented extensive interviews with David's family, friends, teachers, and employers, creating a comprehensive portrait of a young man who seemed to have been struggling with pressures that no one around him had fully recognized or understood. Margaret handled these aged documents with practiced care, noting how the paper had yellowed slightly at the edges and how the typewriter ink had faded to a soft gray. The reports contained details that revealed the social context of the late 1970s, references to concerns about drug use, counterculture influences, and generational conflicts that seemed almost quaint from the perspective of later decades, but had been deeply troubling to parents and authority figures of that time. Detective Walsh's investigation had revealed that David had been saving money from his part-time job at a local grocery store, accumulating an amount that suggested planning for some significant purchase or expense. His school counselor had noted recent changes in his academic performance and social behavior, though nothing dramatic enough to trigger immediate intervention. His closest friends had reported conversations about feeling trapped by expectations and yearning for experiences that their suburban environment couldn't provide. The case file contained photographs of David taken shortly before his disappearance, showing a young man with the kind of serious expression that suggested an intelligence and sensitivity that might have been difficult to navigate in the social environment of a late 1970s high school. There were also photographs of his bedroom, carefully documented by police photographers who had searched for any clues about his intentions or destination. Margaret found these images particularly poignant, these frozen moments that captured a family's life at the moment when it had been disrupted by uncertainty and fear. David's bedroom showed the typical decorations of a teenager from that era. Posters of rock bands and athletes, alongside books and records that suggested eclectic interests. The careful documentation extended to his desk, where school assignments and personal letters had been photographed in place. Before being collected as potential evidence, the investigation had expanded over several weeks, with Detective Walsh coordinating searches of local parks, abandoned buildings, and other areas where a missing teenager might have sought shelter. The reports documented the involvement of volunteer search parties organized by David's school and church, creating a detailed record of a community's response to the disappearance of one of its young members. Margaret turned to the resolution section of the file, finding the report that had brought the case to its conclusion. David had been found 3 weeks after his disappearance, living in a commune that had been established in the mountains about 200 miles from the city. The young people who had created this community were attempting to live according to principles of self-sufficiency and environmental responsibility, supporting themselves through organic farming and craft production. Detective Walsh had traveled to the commune personally to interview David and assess his situation, documenting his findings with the same care he had applied to every other aspect of the case. David had been healthy and apparently happy, though homesick and ready to return to his family. The commune's members had welcomed him and provided support during what he described as a period of confusion and searching for direction in his life. The final reports in the file documented David's reunion with his family and the follow-up conversations that Detective Walsh had conducted to ensure that the underlying issues that had led to his disappearance were being addressed. David had agreed to continue his education while also exploring interests in environmental science and sustainable agriculture that his experience at the commune had awakened. Margaret found a letter in the back of the file, written by David's mother several months after the case had been closed, thanking Detective Walsh for his patience and understanding in handling what could have been approached as a simple runaway case but had required more nuanced attention to the complex motivations that drove a young person's search for meaning and identity. This case exemplified the kind of thorough, humanistic police work that Margaret had observed in many of the older files. Detective Walsh had recognized that David's disappearance was not simply a matter of law enforcement, but a family crisis that required understanding, patience, and sensitivity to the broader social pressures that affected young people during a period of significant cultural change. Margaret carefully returned the O'Connor file to its proper place and selected another folder, this one containing records of a burglary investigation that had revealed unexpected connections to the city's cultural and political landscape. Someone had broken into the offices of the Alternative Press, a weekly newspaper that covered local politics, environmental issues, and countercultural events that received little attention from the mainstream media. The burglary had been unusual in several respects, as documented in the initial report filed by Officer Linda Martinez. The intruder had ignored valuable equipment, including cameras, typewriters, and office furniture, focusing instead on filing cabinets that contained the newspaper's research files and correspondence. The break-in had been discovered by editor Michael Chun when he arrived at the office Monday morning to find papers scattered throughout the workspace. Officer Martinez had approached the investigation with particular attention to the political dimensions of the crime, understanding that newspapers, especially those covering controversial topics, face different types of threats than typical business establishments. Her reports documented conversations with staff members about recent stories that might have attracted unwanted attention, as well as her assessment of the security measures that the newspaper had in place to protect sensitive information. The investigation had revealed that the Alternative Press had been working on a series of articles about environmental contamination at several local industrial sites, research that had required extensive documentation and correspondence with scientists, government officials, and community activists. The scattered papers suggested that someone had been searching specifically for these research files, raising questions about whether the burglary had been motivated by efforts to suppress the newspaper's investigation. Detective Samuel Rodriguez had been assigned to the case, bringing to it the same methodical approach that characterized the best police work of that era. His reports documented extensive interviews with the newspaper's staff, environmental scientists who had been collaborating on the contamination research, and officials from the companies that were the subject of the investigation. Margaret found Detective Rodriguez's approach particularly interesting as documented in these aged files. Rather than focusing solely on the immediate crime, he had worked to understand the broader context in which the burglary had occurred, examining the political and economic pressures that might have motivated someone to target the newspaper's research. The case had ultimately been solved through a combination of traditional detective work and community cooperation. A security guard at one of the industrial facilities under investigation had noticed unusual activity in the company's administrative offices during the same weekend when the newspaper burglary had occurred. This observation had led to discovery that employees of a security firm hired by the company had been conducting unauthorized surveillance of local environmental activists. The resolution of the case had involved not just the arrest of the individuals who had conducted the burglary, but also broader investigations into corporate surveillance activities that had affected multiple community organizations. Detective Rodriguez's final reports documented his cooperation with federal investigators, who had become interested in what appeared to be a systematic effort to intimidate journalists and activists working on environmental issues. These older cases often revealed connections and implications that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances. Margaret reflected as she reviewed Detective Rodriguez's careful documentation. The files served not just as records of individual crimes, but as windows into the social and political tensions that had shaped the community during periods of significant change. She pulled another file, this one dealing with a case of fraud that had affected dozens of elderly residents in the city's Riverside district. Someone had been calling senior citizens, claiming to represent a government agency, and requesting personal information that was then used to access their bank accounts. The scheme had been simple but effective, targeting people who were trusting by nature and less familiar with the sophisticated fraud techniques that had become common in later decades. The investigating officer, Detective Catherine Williams, had approached the case with particular attention to the vulnerability of the victims and the need to provide them with support beyond simply pursuing the perpetrators. Her reports documented not just the financial losses that had occurred, but the emotional trauma that the fraud had created for people who had lived through the Depression and World War II and had developed deep trust in government institutions. Detective Williams had worked closely with local senior centers and community organizations to educate elderly residents about fraud prevention, while also conducting the investigation that eventually led to the arrest of the individuals responsible for the scheme. Her approach had been both proactive and supportive, recognizing that the victims needed both justice and assistance in recovering from the financial and emotional damage they had suffered. The case file contained dozens of victim statements, each one documenting not just the financial details of the fraud, but the personal circumstances that had made each individual vulnerable to this type of deception. Margaret found these statements particularly moving. These records of people who had worked hard throughout their lives only to find themselves targeted by criminals who exploited their trust and good faith. Detective Williams had also documented the broader community response to the fraud, including the establishment of volunteer programs to provide financial counseling and emotional support to elderly residents who had been affected. These community partnerships represented an approach to crime prevention and victim assistance that seemed to have been more common in earlier eras of policing. The resolution of the case had included not just the prosecution of the perpetrators, but also changes in banking procedures and community education programs designed to prevent similar schemes in the future. Detective Williams's final report had included recommendations for systemic improvements that addressed the underlying vulnerabilities that had made the fraud possible. Margaret continued working through the files from Section 7G, finding case after case that reflected the careful, comprehensive approach to police work that seemed to characterize law enforcement during that era. Officers and detectives had taken time to understand the social context of the crimes they investigated and worked to address underlying causes rather than just immediate symptoms, and had documented their work with attention to detail that created rich historical records. She pulled a file dealing with a series of car thefts that had been traced to a group of teenagers who had been joyriding rather than stealing vehicles for profit. The investigating officer, Detective Michael Thompson, had approached the case with understanding that the young people involved were seeking excitement and social connection rather than financial gain, and had worked with their families and community organizations to address the underlying issues that had led to their criminal behavior. The case had been resolved through a combination of traditional law enforcement and creative problem solving that had included community service programs, mentorship opportunities, and recreational activities designed to provide legal alternatives to the excitement that the teenagers had been seeking through car theft. Detective Thompson's reports documented the success of these interventions, noting that none of the young people involved had committed subsequent crimes. These files painted a picture of police work that extended far beyond traditional law enforcement to encompass education, mediation, and community development. The officers whose work was documented in these archives had understood that their role involved not just enforcing laws, but maintaining the social fabric that made community life possible. Margaret found herself impressed by the patience and creativity that characterized so much of the police work from this era. Officers had taken time to understand the people they served, had worked to address root causes rather than just symptoms, and had documented their experiences in ways that provided valuable insights for future generations of law enforcement professionals. As she worked deeper into Section 7G, Margaret encountered files that documented some of the more challenging cases that had tested the skills and resources of the police department during this period. A file dealing with domestic violence cases revealed the limited options that had been available to both victims and law enforcement during an era when such situations were often treated as private family matters rather than criminal behavior. Officer Janet Davis had been one of the first female officers assigned to handle domestic violence cases, and her reports documented her efforts to develop new approaches to situations that had previously received little attention from law enforcement. Her careful documentation had contributed to changes in department policies and state laws that provided better protection for domestic violence victims. The files revealed the gradual evolution of police procedures and social understanding that had occurred during this period. Changes that were documented in the careful reports of officers who had recognized the need for new approaches to persistent social problems. Their work had laid the foundation for many of the victim assistance programs and legal protections that later generations would take for granted. Margaret found records of cases involving juvenile offenders that revealed similar evolution in understanding and approach. Officers had worked to develop alternatives to traditional prosecution for young people whose criminal behavior seemed to stem from family problems, educational difficulties, or lack of positive social opportunities. Detective Robert Johnson had been particularly innovative in his approach to juvenile cases, developing partnerships with schools, community organizations, and social service agencies to create comprehensive support systems for young people at risk. His reports documented the success of these collaborative approaches, showing how investment in prevention and intervention could reduce recidivism and help young people redirect their lives toward positive outcomes. These older files served as both historical documents and practical guides for understanding approaches to law enforcement that had proven effective over time. Margaret had observed that many contemporary police departments were rediscovering techniques and philosophies that had been well established during earlier eras but had been abandoned during periods when law enforcement had focused more narrowly on arrest and prosecution rather than community engagement and problem solving. The archives contained lessons that seemed particularly relevant for current efforts to improve police-community relations and develop more effective approaches to crime prevention. The officers whose work was documented in these files had understood that effective law enforcement required trust, patience, and genuine concern for the welfare of the communities they served. Margaret continued her work through the night, scanning documents and preserving them in digital format, while also taking time to appreciate the wisdom and dedication that they represented. Each file told a story not just of crime and its resolution, but of human beings working together to maintain the conditions that made civilized life possible. The deeper sections of the archives held cases that had been forgotten by everyone except those who had been directly involved. But Margaret understood that these forgotten stories contained valuable lessons about human nature, community dynamics, and the ongoing challenge of balancing individual freedom with collective safety and order. As dawn approached, Margaret completed her work in Section 7G and prepared to return the digitized files to their proper places in the archive system. The cases would continue to rest in their climate-controlled environment, protected from time and decay, waiting for future researchers who might need to understand how previous generations had approached the eternal challenges of law enforcement and community safety. The archives represented more than just storage for old paperwork. They were repositories of collective memory, preserving the experiences and insights of people who had dedicated their careers to the difficult work of serving and protecting their communities. In the growing light of another day, these stories would continue their patient wait, holding their lessons in the eternal silence that surrounded all preserved knowledge, ready to teach anyone willing to learn from the carefully documented wisdom of the past. The old county courthouse stood at the heart of downtown, its limestone facade weathered by decades of seasons, but still maintaining the dignified presence that its architects had intended when they designed it in 1923. During daylight hours, The building bustled with the activity of ongoing legal proceedings, but in the deep hours of night, when the last attorney had gathered their files and the security guards had completed their final rounds, the courthouse settled into a profound quiet that seemed to amplify its connection to the countless cases that had been decided within its walls. Night security guard Thomas Hartwell had been making these rounds for over 15 years, long enough to become familiar with every corner of the building, every creak of its aged floors, every shadow cast by the ornate light fixtures that had been installed during the courthouse's original construction. His footsteps echoed softly through the marble corridors as he conducted his nightly inspection, checking locks, ensuring that the building's many rooms were secure and undisturbed. Tonight, Thomas paused outside courtroom 3, a ceremonial chamber that had been the scene of many of the county's most significant trials over the past 8 decades. The heavy wooden doors bore brass plaques that had been polished countless times by courthouse maintenance staff, and the frosted glass panels allowed a dim view of the space beyond. Thomas used his master key to enter, switching on the lights that illuminated a room designed to inspire respect for the legal process and the weight of judicial decisions. The courtroom retained the formal grandeur of an earlier era, with high ceilings supported by carved wooden beams, tall windows that during daylight hours provided natural illumination for proceedings, and rows of wooden benches that could accommodate hundreds of observers during high-profile trials. The judge's bench dominated the front of the room, elevated above the floor to emphasize the authority and dignity of the judicial process. Thomas had witnessed many trials from his position as security guard, observing the daily drama of the legal system as attorneys presented arguments, witnesses gave testimony, and juries deliberated over the fate of defendants whose lives hung in the balance. But in these quiet nighttime hours, the courtroom took on a different character, becoming a repository of memory rather than a venue for active proceedings. The walls of Courtroom 3A held the accumulated weight of thousands of cases that had been decided there, from simple civil disputes to complex criminal trials that had captured regional attention. Thomas often found himself imagining the conversations that had taken place at the counsel tables, the arguments that had been presented from the lectern, the verdicts that had been announced from the jury box. One of the most significant cases tried in this courtroom had been the prosecution of Marcus Wheeler for bank robbery, a trial that had taken place in the spring of 1987 and had drawn attention from throughout the state due to the unusual circumstances surrounding the crime. Wheeler had been accused of robbing the First National Bank, but the evidence presented during the trial had revealed a more complex story that challenged simple notions of guilt and innocence. The case had begun when Wheeler had entered the bank on a Tuesday morning, apparently armed and demanding money from the tellers. However, the investigation had revealed that Wheeler had been suffering from severe mental illness, experiencing delusions that had convinced him that the bank was holding money that rightfully belonged to his deceased father. His actions had been motivated not by greed, but by a genuine belief that he was recovering stolen property. The trial had featured extensive testimony from psychiatrists, social workers, and family members who had attempted to provide the jury with a complete picture of Wheeler's mental state and the circumstances that had led to his actions. The prosecution had been required to prove criminal intent, while the defense had argued that Wheeler's mental illness had prevented him from forming the intent necessary for conviction. Thomas remembered the day when the jury had delivered their verdict, finding Wheeler not guilty by reason of mental illness. The decision had been controversial, with some members of the community arguing that it set a dangerous precedent, while others praised the jury's recognition that the criminal justice system needed to account for the complexities of mental health issues. The resolution of the case had led to Wheeler's commitment to a state mental health facility, where he had received treatment that had eventually allowed him to stabilize and return to the community under supervised care. The trial had also prompted discussions about the need for better mental health services and more effective intervention programs to prevent similar situations in the future. Thomas continued his rounds through the courthouse, moving to the holding cells that were located in the basement level of the building. These cells had been designed to temporarily house defendants during trial proceedings, providing secure but humane accommodations for people awaiting their day in court. The cells were small but clean, with basic furnishings that met constitutional requirements for pre-trial detention. The holding area carried its own weight of history, having housed thousands of defendants over the decades. Some had been guilty of the crimes with which they were charged, while others had been innocent victims of circumstance or mistaken identity. All had shared the experience of waiting in these small spaces while their fate was decided by judges and juries in the courtrooms above. Thomas remembered one particular case that had involved these holding cells: the trial of Sarah Martinez for embezzlement from her employer, a local nonprofit organization that provided services to low-income families. The case had been complicated by the fact that Martinez had been stealing money not for personal enrichment, but to provide emergency assistance to clients whose needs exceeded the organization's official resources. The trial had raised difficult questions about the relationship between legal requirements and moral obligations, as Martinez's attorney had argued that her actions, while technically illegal, had been motivated by a genuine desire to help people who had nowhere else to turn. The prosecution had maintained that regardless of her motivations, Martinez had violated the trust placed in her and had undermined the organization's ability to serve its mission. The case had been particularly poignant because many of the families who had received Martinez's unauthorized assistance had come forward to testify on her behalf, describing how her help had prevented evictions, provided emergency medical care, and kept children from going hungry. The jury had been faced with the challenge of weighing legal requirements against human compassion. The verdict had been guilty, but the judge had imposed a sentence that reflected the unusual circumstances of the case, requiring Martinez to perform community service rather than serve prison time. The resolution had also led to changes in the nonprofit organization's policies, creating more flexible procedures for providing emergency assistance while maintaining proper financial controls. Thomas moved through the basement corridors, checking the various storage rooms and office spaces that housed the administrative functions supporting the courthouse's operations. These areas were less grand than the courtrooms above, but they were equally important to the functioning of the legal system, providing space for the clerks, bailiffs, and other staff members who ensured that trials proceeded smoothly and that records were properly maintained. One of these rooms housed the files for ongoing cases, documents that would eventually be transferred to the permanent archives, but were currently needed for active legal proceedings. The room was filled with filing cabinets and document boxes, all carefully labeled and organized according to the court clerk's systematic approach to record keeping. Thomas had observed the careful attention that court staff paid to maintaining these records, understanding that the proper documentation of legal proceedings was essential to the integrity of the justice system. Every transcript, every exhibit, every motion filed by attorneys became part of the permanent record that could be referenced years later if cases were appealed or if questions arose about how particular decisions had been reached. The courthouse also contained offices for probation officers, social workers, and victim advocates who worked within the justice system to provide support services for people affected by criminal cases. These offices were located on the second floor of the building, in spaces that had been renovated over the years to accommodate the expanding recognition that effective justice required more than simply determining guilt or innocence. Thomas checked these offices as part of his nightly routine, ensuring that confidential files were properly secured and that the spaces were ready for the next day's activities. He had come to appreciate the important work that these professionals performed, providing services that helped defendants reintegrate into the community, while also supporting victims as they recovered from the trauma of criminal victimization. One of the probation officers, Janet Walsh, had been particularly effective in working with juvenile offenders, developing innovative programs that addressed the underlying issues that led young people into criminal behavior. Her office contained files documenting dozens of success stories, cases where intensive supervision and support services had helped teenagers redirect their lives toward positive outcomes. Thomas remembered one case that Walsh had handled, involving a 15-year-old named Kevin Morrison, who had been caught stealing car stereos from vehicles parked in shopping center lots. Rather than simply processing Morrison through the traditional juvenile justice system, Walsh had worked to understand the circumstances that had led to his criminal behavior. The investigation had revealed that Morrison was living with his grandmother after his parents had been killed in an automobile accident, struggling with grief and anger while also dealing with the practical challenges of adjusting to a new living situation. His theft had been motivated partly by financial need and partly by a desire to impress older teenagers who had been encouraging his criminal activity. Walsh had developed a comprehensive intervention plan that included grief counseling, tutoring to help Morrison catch up academically, and a mentorship program that connected him with positive adult role models. She had also worked with Morrison's grandmother to ensure that she had access to the support services she needed to provide effective care for her grandson. The program had been successful, with Morrison completing his probation without additional incidents and eventually graduating from high school with plans to attend community college. His case had become a model for other juvenile intervention programs, demonstrating the effectiveness of addressing underlying causes rather than simply punishing criminal behavior. Thomas climbed the stairs to the third floor of the courthouse, where additional courtrooms handled civil cases, family court proceedings, and other specialized legal matters. These courtrooms were smaller than the grand chambers used for major criminal trials, but they were equally important to the community's efforts to resolve conflicts and maintain social order. One of these courtrooms, 3C, had been the site of numerous family court proceedings over the years, handling divorce cases, child custody disputes, and other matters involving domestic relationships. The judge who presided over these cases, the Honorable Patricia Chun, had developed a reputation for patience and wisdom in dealing with the emotionally charged situations that characterized family law. Thomas had observed many of these proceedings during his years at the courthouse, noting the skill with which Judge Chun navigated the complex interpersonal dynamics that were often involved in family disputes. She had understood that her role extended beyond simply applying legal standards to include helping families find solutions that protected the welfare of children while respecting the rights and needs of all parties involved. One case that had particularly impressed Thomas involved a custody dispute between divorced parents who had been unable to agree on arrangements for their 8-year-old daughter. The initial proceedings had been contentious, with both parents convinced that the other was unfit and that they should have exclusive custody of the child. Judge Shen had ordered a comprehensive evaluation of the family situation, involving social workers, child psychologists, and other professionals who could assess the child's needs and the capacity of each parent to meet those needs. Rather than simply choosing between the parents' competing claims, she had worked to develop a custody arrangement that maximized the child's access to both parents while ensuring her safety and stability. The process had taken several months, with multiple hearings and extensive documentation of the child's adjustment to various proposed arrangements. Judge Chen had insisted on putting the child's welfare above the parents' preferences, making decisions based on professional assessments rather than the emotional arguments that characterized much of the initial proceedings. The final custody arrangement had required both parents to participate in parenting classes and counseling programs, designed to help them develop more effective co-parenting strategies. Judge Chen had also established regular review hearings to monitor the family's adjustment and make modifications, if necessary, to ensure the child's continued welfare. The case had been successful in creating a stable environment for the child, while also helping the parents learn to work together more effectively. Thomas had seen the family returning to court for routine review hearings over the years, noting the gradual improvement in the parents' ability to communicate and collaborate in their daughter's best interests. These family court proceedings represented one of the most challenging aspects of the judicial system, requiring judges to make decisions about intimate personal relationships based on limited information and legal standards that might not fully capture the complexity of family dynamics. Judge Chen's patient, thorough approach had served as a model for other family court judges throughout the region. Thomas continued his security rounds, checking the various support facilities that were essential to the courthouse's operation. The building contained a law library that was used by attorneys, judges, and members of the public who represented themselves in legal proceedings. The library was housed in a large room on the second floor, with tall windows that provided natural light during daytime hours and shelves that held thousands of law books, legal periodicals, and reference materials. The law library represented the accumulated wisdom of the legal system, containing statutes, case law, and legal commentary that guided the decisions made in the courthouse's various proceedings. Thomas had observed attorneys spending long hours in the library, researching precedents and preparing arguments for upcoming cases. The library also served members of the public who could not afford attorneys but needed legal information to represent themselves in court proceedings. The reference librarian, Margaret Foster, had developed considerable expertise in helping people navigate the complex legal resources and find information relevant to their particular situations. Thomas remembered one evening when he had encountered Foster working late, helping a single mother prepare for a custody hearing in which she would be representing herself against her ex-husband who had hired an attorney. Foster had spent hours helping the woman understand the relevant legal standards and prepare documents that would effectively present her case to the judge. This type of assistance represented an important service that the courthouse provided to community members who might otherwise be unable to access the legal system effectively. Foster's patient guidance had helped numerous people represent themselves competently in proceedings that might have been overwhelming without professional support. The courthouse also contained facilities for jury deliberations, small rooms where citizens called for jury duty could privately discuss evidence and reach verdicts in criminal and civil cases. These jury rooms were simple but comfortable spaces, designed to provide an environment where people could focus on their important civic responsibility without distraction. Thomas had always been impressed by the dedication that ordinary citizens showed when called for jury duty, taking time from their work and family obligations to participate in the legal system. The jury rooms had witnessed countless discussions as people wrestled with complex evidence and tried to reach fair decisions in difficult cases. One jury deliberation that had particularly struck Thomas involved a personal injury case where a construction worker had been seriously injured in an accident at a building site. The case had required the jury to determine whether the injury had been caused by the worker's negligence, the employer's failure to provide adequate safety equipment, or simply an unavoidable accident. The deliberation had lasted 3 days, with jurors carefully reviewing evidence and expert testimony to understand the technical aspects of construction safety. The jury room had been filled with diagrams, photographs, and documents as the citizens worked to understand exactly what had happened and who should be held responsible for the worker's injuries. The final verdict had found the employer partially liable for failing to provide proper safety training, while also recognizing that the worker had contributed to the accident by not following established safety procedures. The decision had resulted in a financial settlement that provided compensation for the worker's medical expenses and lost wages, while also establishing precedents for construction safety standards. These jury deliberations represented one of the most important aspects of the American legal system: the participation of ordinary citizens in the administration of justice. Thomas had observed that juries generally took their responsibilities seriously, working carefully to understand complex evidence and reach fair decisions based on the law and the facts presented during trials. As his shift continued through the early morning hours, Thomas completed his rounds of the courthouse's various facilities, ensuring that the building was secure and ready for another day of legal proceedings. The courthouse would soon fill again with the activity of attorneys, judges, court staff, and citizens participating in the ongoing work of maintaining justice and resolving conflicts within the framework of law. But in these quiet hours before dawn, the building rested in contemplative silence, holding within its walls the accumulated weight of thousands of cases that had been decided over the decades. Each courtroom, each office, each corridor carried the memory of human dramas that had played out within the formal structure of legal proceedings. The old county courthouse stood as a monument to the community's commitment to justice, a physical embodiment of the principle that conflicts could be resolved through reason, evidence, and the application of law rather than through force or arbitrary power. Thomas felt privileged to serve as the building's guardian during these quiet hours, protecting the space where so many important decisions had been made and would continue to be made in service of justice and the common good. In the growing light of another day, the courthouse would awaken to new cases, new challenges, and new opportunities to demonstrate that a community committed to justice could find fair and peaceful solutions to even the most difficult human conflicts. The building itself would continue to provide the dignified setting that such important work deserved, its walls holding the memory of past decisions while remaining ready to witness the continuation of humanity's ongoing effort to live together under the rule of law. The Riverside District stretched along the eastern edge of the city, a collection of tree-lined streets where modest homes had sheltered the same families for decades, sometimes generations. Police Sergeant Maria Santos had been assigned to this neighborhood beat for 7 years, long enough to know not just the addresses where calls originated, but the people who lived behind those front doors, their histories, their struggles, and their connections to the broader community that made the district feel more like an extended family than simply a geographic area. On quiet evening shifts like this one, Sergeant Santos often found herself driving slowly through the familiar streets, observing the subtle signs that indicated how the neighborhood was doing. Porch lights glowing warmly suggested families settled in for the evening, while darkened windows might indicate residents who worked night shifts or elderly people who retired early. The rhythm of these observations had become as natural to her as breathing, a constant awareness of the community's pulse that helped her understand when something was amiss. Asterisk. Tonight she paused outside the small house on Elm Street where the Henderson family had lived since 1982, when Robert and Marie Henderson had bought their first home as newlyweds. Sergeant Santos had responded to calls at this address several times over the years, but not because the Hendersons were troublemakers. Rather, their home seemed to serve as an unofficial community center, a place where neighbors brought problems that needed the kind of patient attention that law enforcement could provide when it approached situations with understanding rather than simply authority. The most recent call had involved the Hendersons' 16-year-old son Michael, who had been caught shoplifting at the local pharmacy. The incident had been minor, a package of gum and a candy bar that totaled less than $3, but it had created significant concern for parents who had raised their son to respect other people's property, and had been baffled by behavior that seemed completely out of character. Sergeant Santos had responded to the pharmacy owner's call, but rather than simply processing Michael through the juvenile justice system, she had taken time to understand the circumstances that had led to the incident. Her conversation with the teenager had revealed that he had been under pressure from classmates to prove his courage by taking something without paying. A stupid decision that he immediately regretted and had been trying to figure out how to undo when the store manager had confronted him. The resolution had involved more than just law enforcement, extending into the kind of community problem solving that characterized much of Sergeant Santos's work in Riverside. She had arranged for Michael to work off his debt to the pharmacy owner through after-school labor, sweeping floors and stocking shelves, while also learning about the challenges that small business owners faced in maintaining profitable operations. More importantly, Sergeant Santos had worked with Michael's parents and school counselor to address the peer pressure situation that had contributed to the shoplifting incident. This had led to broader discussions about teenage social dynamics and the development of programs to help young people resist negative influences while building positive relationships within the community. The outcome had been successful on multiple levels. Michael had learned valuable lessons about personal responsibility and the impact of his actions on others. His parents had gained insight into the social pressures their son was facing and had developed better communication strategies for addressing future challenges. The pharmacy owner had been impressed by Michael's work ethic and had offered him a part-time job when he turned 18. Sergeant Santos continued her patrol through the neighborhood, turning onto Maple Street, where the Rodriguez family had been dealing with challenges that stretched back several generations. The current situation involved Elena Rodriguez, a 24-year-old single mother who was raising 2 young children while also caring for her aging mother, who suffered from diabetes and required regular medical attention. The law enforcement connection had begun when neighbors had called to report what sounded like domestic disturbances coming from the Rodriguez house. Loud arguments and crying that suggested someone was in distress. Sergeant Santos's investigation had revealed that the sounds were related to the stress of Elena's caregiving responsibilities, rather than any kind of abuse or violence. Elena had been struggling to balance the demands of caring for her children and her mother while also working 2 part-time jobs to meet the family's financial needs. The stress had been overwhelming, leading to emotional outbursts and arguments with her mother about medical compliance and household responsibilities. The situation had been further complicated by Elena's limited English skills, which made it difficult for her to navigate the healthcare and social service systems that might have provided assistance. Sergeant Santos had approached this situation as a community problem, requiring community solutions. She had connected Elena with a social worker who specialized in helping families access available support services. She had also worked with local churches and community organizations to identify volunteers who could provide occasional respite care and transportation assistance. The resolution had involved creating a support network that addressed multiple aspects of Elena's situation. A retired nurse from the neighborhood had volunteered to help manage her mother's medical care, ensuring that medications were taken properly and that medical appointments were kept. A local church had organized a meal delivery program that reduced Elena's household responsibilities while also providing social contact that reduced her sense of isolation. Elena had eventually been able to reduce her work hours to 1 full-time position with benefits, improving both her financial stability and her ability to manage family responsibilities. Her children had been enrolled in after-school programs that provided educational support and social activities while also giving Elena more time to address her mother's needs. These kinds of interventions represented the intersection between law enforcement and social work that characterized much of police work in residential neighborhoods like Riverside. Sergeant Santos had learned that many situations that came to police attention were symptoms of larger social and economic problems that required collaborative solutions involving multiple community resources. She drove past the small apartment complex on Oak Street, where several families lived in subsidized housing, a development that had been constructed in the Wichita 1970s to provide affordable accommodation for working families with limited incomes. The complex had experienced various challenges over the years, including problems with drug activity, noise complaints, and conflicts between neighbors with different lifestyles and cultural backgrounds. Sergeant Santos had been working with the complex's management and resident council to address these issues through a combination of improved security measures and community building activities. The approach had been based on the understanding that most problems in residential communities stemmed from lack of communication and mutual understanding rather than malicious intent. One particular case had involved tensions between the Nguyen family, recent immigrants from Vietnam, and their neighbors, an elderly couple named the Johnsons who had lived in the complex since it opened. The conflicts had begun with complaints about cooking odors, unfamiliar music, and what the Johnsons perceived as excessive noise from the Nguyen children playing in the hallway. Sergeant Santos had facilitated conversations between the families that had revealed the misunderstandings underlying their conflicts. The Johnsons had been feeling isolated and overlooked as the complex's demographics had changed, while the Nguyens had been struggling to understand American customs and had been unaware that their activities were creating problems for neighbors. The resolution had involved both practical accommodations and relationship building. The Nguyen's had agreed to use kitchen exhaust fans when cooking strongly scented foods, and to keep their children's play activities within their apartment during evening hours. The Johnsons had agreed to approach the Nguyens directly with concerns rather than immediately calling police or management. More significantly, Sergeant Santos had helped arrange cultural exchange activities that had allowed the families to learn about each other's backgrounds and traditions. Mrs. Johnson had taught Mrs. Nguyen some basic English conversation skills, while Mrs. Nguyen had shared cooking techniques and recipes that had introduced the Johnsons to Vietnamese cuisine. These relationship-building efforts had transformed the apartment complex's social dynamics, creating a more cohesive community where neighbors looked out for each other rather than viewing each other with suspicion or resentment. The success had led to the establishment of regular community gatherings and mutual support networks that had reduced the need for police intervention in minor disputes. Sergeant Santos turned onto Pine Street, where the Morrison family had been dealing with challenges related to teenage substance abuse. Their 17-year-old daughter Jennifer had been caught with marijuana at school, leading to her suspension and creating a family crisis that had required careful navigation of legal, educational, and personal issues. The incident had been Jennifer's first encounter with the law, and her parents had been devastated by behavior that seemed to contradict the values they had tried to instill. The situation had been complicated by the fact that Jennifer was a good student with no previous disciplinary problems, making her drug use particularly puzzling to family members and school officials. Sergeant Santos had worked with the family to develop a response that addressed both the legal requirements and the underlying issues that had led to Jennifer's drug use. This had involved connecting the family with counseling services that specialized in adolescent substance abuse while also ensuring that Jennifer met the legal obligations associated with her offense. The investigation had revealed that Jennifer had been using marijuana to cope with anxiety about academic performance, and social acceptance. Pressures that had been intensified by her parents' high expectations and her own perfectionist tendencies. The drug use had been self-medication for mental health issues that had gone unrecognized and untreated. Asterisk, the resolution had involved comprehensive family therapy that had helped all family members develop better communication skills and more realistic expectations. Jennifer had received treatment for anxiety that had included both counseling and medication management. Her parents had learned to recognize signs of stress in their daughter and had developed more supportive approaches to helping her manage academic and social pressures. Jennifer had completed her legal obligations through community service that had involved working with younger children in after-school programs, an experience that had helped her develop leadership skills and a sense of purpose beyond academic achievement. She had also become involved in peer counseling programs that had allowed her to help other teenagers who were struggling with similar issues. The case had been successful not just in addressing Jennifer's immediate problems, but in strengthening the entire family's ability to handle future challenges. The Morrison parents had become advocates for improved mental health services for teenagers, working with school officials and community organizations to develop programs that address the underlying causes of adolescent substance abuse. These family-centered interventions reflected Sergeant Santos's understanding that effective law enforcement in residential communities required attention to the social and emotional factors that influenced individual behavior. Her approach emphasized prevention and rehabilitation rather than simply punishment, recognizing that most people who came into contact with the legal system were capable of positive change when provided with appropriate support and guidance. She continued her patrol through the neighborhood, observing the various houses where she had been involved in cases that had touched entire extended families. The Lopez family on Cedar Street had dealt with issues related to domestic violence that had required careful intervention to protect victims while also addressing the underlying causes of family conflict. The situation had involved Carlos Lopez, a 42-year-old construction worker who had been becoming increasingly controlling and violent toward his wife Maria and their 3 children. The abuse had escalated over several months, culminating in an incident where Maria had called police after Carlos had pushed her during an argument about household finances. Sergeant Santos had responded to the call with particular attention to the safety of all family members, including Carlos, who had been clearly struggling with anger management and stress related to unemployment and financial pressures. The incident had required immediate intervention to ensure Maria's safety, while also beginning a longer-term process of addressing the family's complex needs. The legal response had included Carlos's arrest and prosecution for domestic assault, but Sergeant Santos had also worked to connect the family with services that addressed the underlying issues contributing to the violence. Maria had been connected with domestic violence counselors and legal advocates who had helped her understand her options and develop safety plans. Carlos had been required to participate in anger management programs and substance abuse counseling as part of his sentence, interventions that had helped him develop better coping strategies for managing stress and conflict. The family had also received financial counseling and job placement assistance that had addressed some of the economic pressures that had contributed to household tensions. The resolution had been gradual and required ongoing monitoring to ensure that the violence did not recur. Sergeant Santos had maintained regular contact with the family for over a year, checking on their progress and providing referrals to additional services as needs arose. The outcome had been successful, with Carlos learning to manage his anger more effectively and Maria regaining confidence in her ability to protect herself and her children. The case had also led to broader community education about domestic violence recognition and prevention, with Sergeant Santos working with local organizations to develop programs that help neighbors and family members identify warning signs and provide appropriate support to victims. As her shift continued through the quiet hours of early morning, Sergeant Santos reflected on the complex web of relationships that connected families throughout the Riverside district. Crime rarely occurred in isolation, she had learned, but was usually the result of multiple stressors and circumstances that affected entire social networks. The Chun family on Birch Street had experienced this kind of ripple effect when their 20-year-old son, David, had been arrested for drunk driving after a party at a friend's house. The incident had been David's first serious encounter with the law, but its impact had extended throughout the extended family and social network that surrounded the Chuns. David's arrest had created shame and embarrassment for his parents, who were prominent members of the local Chinese American community, and felt that their son's behavior reflected poorly on their family's reputation. The situation had been complicated by cultural expectations about family honor and the difficulty of addressing alcohol abuse within a community that had traditionally avoided discussing such problems openly. Sergeant Santos had worked with the family to address both the legal consequences of David's actions and the cultural tensions that had been created by the incident. This had involved connecting the Chuns with counselors who understood the specific challenges faced by immigrant families, dealing with generational conflicts and cultural adaptation. David had been required to complete alcohol education programs and community service as part of his sentence. But he had also received counseling that helped him understand how his drinking had been related to stress, about meeting family expectations, and navigating between different cultural identities. The resolution had involved broader community discussions about alcohol abuse prevention and the importance of addressing mental health issues within immigrant communities. The Chun family had eventually become advocates for more open discussion of these issues, helping to reduce the stigma that had prevented other families from seeking help when needed. These cases demonstrated the interconnected nature of family and community life in neighborhoods like Riverside, where law enforcement officers needed to understand not just individual incidents, but the broader social context in which they occurred. Sergeant Santos had learned to see her role as encompassing community, health and wellness rather than simply crime prevention and response. The neighborhood contained numerous families who had been affected by law enforcement interventions over the years, creating a shared experience that had generally strengthened rather than damaged community bonds. The key had been approaching each situation with respect for family dignity and genuine concern for long-term outcomes rather than simply processing cases through the legal system. As dawn approached and Sergeant Santos prepared to end her shift, she drove once more through the familiar streets of Riverside, noting the early signs of the neighborhood awakening to another day. Porch lights were switching off as natural light began to filter through the mature trees that lined the streets. Here and there, kitchen windows glowed as early risers prepared for work or school. The families in these houses would continue their daily lives, most of them never needing police intervention, but all of them benefiting from the presence of law enforcement that understood the community's rhythms and needs. The cases that had brought Sergeant Santos into their lives had become part of their family histories, stories that would be told in different ways to future generations, but that had ultimately strengthened their connections to each other and to the larger community that sustained them. In the growing light of another day, the Riverside District prepared to continue its ongoing experiment in democratic community life, where people from different backgrounds and circumstances worked together to create neighborhoods that were safe, welcoming, and supportive of human flourishing. The role of law enforcement in this process was to provide the security and stability that allowed families to invest in long-term relationships and commitments that made such communities possible. The Central Police Station never truly slept, but during the night shift hours between midnight and 8 a.m., it settled into a different rhythm, one characterized by the soft murmur of radio communications, the gentle clicking of keyboards, and the quiet conversations that took place in patrol cars parked under streetlights throughout the city. Officer David Kim had been working the night shift for 6 years. long enough to understand that this period offered a unique perspective on law enforcement. When the urgency of daytime calls gave way to the patient vigilance required for protecting the community at rest. The station's main dispatch center operated with skeleton staffing during these hours, but the activity never ceased entirely. Dispatcher Helen Martinez had been handling night communications for over a decade, developing an almost supernatural ability to hear subtle changes in officers' voices that indicated when routine calls might be developing into more serious situations. Her workstation was surrounded by multiple computer monitors displaying maps, case databases, and communication logs that allowed her to coordinate resources across the city while maintaining awareness of every officer's location and status. Tonight had been relatively quiet, with the usual mix of domestic disturbances, burglar alarms, and traffic violations that characterized most midnight shifts. Officer Kim had responded to 3 calls during his first 4 hours, none of them requiring dramatic intervention, but all requiring the patient attention to detail that separated effective police work from simple crisis response. The first call had taken him to Riverside Apartments, where an elderly resident named Mrs. Patterson had reported hearing what sounded like breaking glass in the unit above her bedroom. Officer Kim had arrived to find that the sound had been caused by a ceramic vase falling from a windowsill, probably dislodged by the building's aging heating system, creating vibrations throughout the structure. The incident itself had been minor, but Officer Kim had spent nearly an hour at the scene, understanding that Mrs. Patterson's concern reflected broader anxieties about safety and security that affected many elderly residents living alone. His report documented not just the immediate cause of the disturbance, but his observations about the building's maintenance needs and Mrs. Patterson's social isolation. During their conversation, Officer Kim had learned that Mrs. Patterson rarely left her apartment except for essential errands, having few social connections and limited financial resources for recreational activities. Her hypervigilance about suspicious sounds reflected her vulnerability and her dependence on law enforcement for reassurance about her safety. The resolution had involved more than simply explaining the source of the noise. Officer Kim had provided Mrs. Patterson with contact information for senior services programs that could help address her isolation while also arranging for building management to inspect the heating system that had caused the initial disturbance. This type of community policing required understanding that many calls for service reflected underlying social needs rather than immediate criminal activity. Officer Kim's patient approach had addressed Mrs. Patterson's concerns while also identifying problems that could be prevented through proactive intervention. The second call of his shift had involved a burglar alarm at Morrison Hardware Store, a family-owned business that had been operating in the downtown area for over 40 years. Alarm calls were routine during night shifts, with the vast majority triggered by equipment malfunctions, weather conditions, or simple human error rather than actual break-ins. Officer Kim had arrived at the store to find no signs of forced entry or criminal activity, but his investigation had revealed that the alarm system was malfunctioning due to a power fluctuation that had occurred during a brief thunderstorm earlier in the evening. The store's owner, Robert Morrison, had been contacted and had arrived within 20 minutes to reset the system and ensure that the building was secure. Incident had provided an opportunity for Officer Kim to conduct a security assessment of the business district, noting potential vulnerabilities and recommending improvements that could reduce the likelihood of actual break-ins. His report had included observations about street lighting, visibility from the main road, and the condition of locks and security equipment at various businesses. These security assessments represented an important aspect of preventive policing, identifying and addressing conditions that might attract criminal activity before crimes actually occurred. Officer Kim's recommendations had been shared with business owners and city maintenance departments to ensure that appropriate improvements were implemented. The third call had been more complex, involving a domestic disturbance at an apartment where a young couple had been arguing loudly enough to disturb neighbors. Officer Kim had arrived to find Marcus and Jennifer Thompson, both in their mid-20s, attempting to resolve a disagreement about financial responsibilities that had escalated beyond reasonable discussion. Neither party had been physically aggressive, but their argument had been intense enough to create genuine concern for neighbors who had been awakened by shouting and what sounded like furniture being moved. The situation required careful assessment to determine whether intervention was necessary and what type of response would be most helpful. Officer Kim had spent over an hour with the couple, helping them understand how their conflict was affecting their neighbors, while also providing resources for addressing the underlying financial stress that had triggered their argument. The resolution had involved both immediate problem solving and referrals to longer-term support services. Marcus had been unemployed for several weeks following a layoff from his construction job, creating financial pressure that had strained the relationship. Jennifer had been working extra hours to compensate for the lost income, leading to fatigue and resentment that had contributed to their conflict. Officer Kim had connected the couple with employment assistance programs and financial counseling services that could help them develop strategies for managing their temporary economic difficulties. He had also provided information about conflict resolution techniques that could help them address future disagreements more constructively. These types of interventions reflected the night shift's unique role in community life, providing support services during hours when most other resources were unavailable. Officer Kim had learned that many situations that appeared to be simple law enforcement matters actually required social work skills and knowledge of community resources. As his shift progressed through the early morning hours, Officer Kim continued his patrol through the quiet streets, observing the subtle signs that indicated how different neighborhoods were doing. Well-maintained properties with adequate lighting suggested stable communities, while areas with broken streetlights or accumulating trash might indicate social or economic problems that required attention. The radio chatter from other officers provided a constant background awareness of activities throughout the city. Officer Martinez was handling a traffic accident on the east side that involved no injuries but required coordination with towing services and traffic control. Officer Johnson was investigating a suspicious person call that had turned out to be a homeless individual seeking shelter behind a closed business. These communications created a sense of shared responsibility and mutual support that characterized night shift work. Officers understood that they were part of a coordinated effort to maintain public safety, with each individual call contributing to the larger goal of protecting the community during its most vulnerable hours. Officer Kim's radio crackled with a new call. A report of vandalism at Lincoln Elementary School, where someone had apparently spray-painted graffiti on the side of the building. He acknowledged the call and began driving toward the school, automatically reviewing the mental checklist of procedures for investigating property damage cases. The school sat in a residential neighborhood that had experienced occasional problems with teenage mischief but had never been the target of serious criminal activity. Officer Kim arrived to find that someone had indeed spray-painted several words and symbols on the brick wall facing the playground. But the graffiti appeared to be the work of inexperienced vandals rather than organized taggers. His investigation revealed no signs of forced entry into the building and no damage beyond the graffiti itself. The symbols and words painted on the wall suggested teenage experimentation with rebellion rather than malicious destruction. But the incident still required thorough documentation for insurance purposes and Potential prosecution if suspects were identified. Officer Kim photographed the graffiti from multiple angles, noting details that might help identify the materials used and the techniques employed. He also canvassed the surrounding area for additional evidence, checking nearby dumpsters for discarded spray, paint cans, and examining the ground for footprints or other traces of the vandal's presence. The school's principal, Dr. Sarah Chun, arrived while Officer Kim was completing his investigation. She had been contacted by the automated security system that had detected motion in the area during the early morning hours. Her response reflected the serious concern that school officials felt about maintaining safe learning environments for students. Officer Kim's conversation with Dr. Chun revealed that the school had been working to address problems with unsupervised teenagers gathering in the area during evening hours, particularly on weekends when organized activities were not available. The graffiti appeared to be related to these broader issues of youth supervision and recreational opportunities. The resolution had involved both immediate response to the vandalism and longer-term planning to address underlying problems. Officer Kim had coordinated with school maintenance staff to arrange for prompt removal of the graffiti while also working with Dr. Chun to develop strategies for preventing future incidents. These strategies had included improved lighting around the school perimeter, increased coordination with parents about youth supervision, and partnerships with community organizations to provide evening recreational programs that would give teenagers positive alternatives to unsupervised gathering. Officer Kim's report had documented not just the immediate incident, but the broader community factors that had contributed to the problem and the collaborative solutions that had been developed to prevent recurrence. This comprehensive approach reflected the night shift's unique perspective on crime prevention and community engagement. As dawn approached, Officer Kim received his final call of the shift, a report of a missing elderly person who had wandered away from a nursing home on the north side of the city. These calls required immediate response due to the vulnerability of elderly people with dementia or other cognitive impairments, who might become confused and unable to find their way back to safety. The missing person was Harold Morrison, an 82-year-old man with early-stage Alzheimer's disease who had apparently left the Sunrise Care facility sometime during the night shift change. The facility staff had discovered his absence during routine room checks and had immediately contacted police while also organizing their own search of the building and surrounding grounds. Officer Kim arrived at the facility to coordinate the search effort, working with nursing home staff to understand Harold's typical behavior patterns and the routes he might have taken if he had become confused about his location. These cases required rapid deployment of resources while also maintaining sensitivity to the dignity and safety of vulnerable individuals. The search had involved multiple patrol units, each covering different areas based on Harold's known preferences and the likelihood that he might have been attracted to familiar landmarks from his earlier life in the community. Officer Kim had coordinated with dispatch to ensure that all units had current photographs and descriptions while also maintaining communication with Harold's family members who had been contacted about his disappearance. Harold had been found approximately 2 hours later, sitting peacefully on a bench in Riverside Park, apparently watching the sunrise over the river. He had been unharmed but confused about how he had arrived at the location and unable to remember leaving the nursing home. Officer Kim had approached him carefully, using techniques he had learned for communicating with people experiencing cognitive impairment. The reunion with nursing home staff had been emotional but careful, with everyone involved understanding that Harold's wandering represented a symptom of his medical condition rather than any kind of intentional misconduct. Officer Kim had documented the incident thoroughly while also working with facility administrators to review security procedures and prevent similar occurrences. The resolution had involved not just Harold's safe return, but also comprehensive evaluation of the nursing home's policies for monitoring residents who might be at risk for wandering. Officer Kim had provided recommendations for improved security measures while ensuring that any changes would preserve residents' dignity and quality of life. These missing person cases represented one of the most challenging aspects of night shift work, requiring rapid response and coordination while also demonstrating sensitivity to the complex medical and social issues that affected elderly community members. As Officer Kim completed his final report of the shift, he reflected on the variety of situations that had required his attention during the past 8 hours. None of the incidents had involved dramatic criminal activity, but all had required the patient application of professional skills and community knowledge that characterized effective law enforcement. The night shift offered unique opportunities to observe community life from a different perspective, to see how people lived during the quiet hours, when most social institutions were closed and formal support systems were less available. Officers working these hours often found themselves serving as informal social workers, crisis counselors, and community liaisons in addition to their traditional law enforcement functions. The dispatch center had maintained its steady coordination throughout the night, with Helen Martinez ensuring that resources were allocated efficiently and that officers received appropriate backup when situations required additional personnel. Her voice had provided a constant reassuring presence on the radio, connecting individual officers to the larger network of support that made their work possible. As the morning shift officers began arriving at the station to take over patrol duties, the night shift personnel prepared to complete their reports and transition responsibility for ongoing cases. The continuity of police services required careful documentation and communication between shifts, ensuring that important information was preserved and that emerging problems received appropriate attention. Officer Kim's shift had concluded with the satisfaction that came from contributing to community safety through patient, professional service. The incidents he had handled would be filed and archived, becoming part of the permanent record of law enforcement activities that documented the ongoing effort to maintain public safety and order. The night shift represented law enforcement at its most fundamental level, the basic function of watching over communities while they slept, and ensuring that people could rest securely in the knowledge that help would be available if needed. This ancient responsibility had been transformed by modern technology and professional training, but its essential character remained unchanged, the commitment to serve and protect that made civilized community life possible. In the growing light of another day, the night shift officers would rest while their colleagues continued the work, knowing that they had fulfilled their part in the eternal cycle of vigilance that protected democratic communities and preserved the peace that allowed families and individuals to pursue their dreams in safety and security. Evidence technician Linda Walsh moved through the climate-controlled storage facility with the careful precision of someone who understood that every item in her care represented a human story that had intersected with the legal system. The warehouse-style building housed thousands of cases worth of physical evidence, from recent investigations still working their way through the courts to decades-old files that had been archived after their legal relevance had ended but before they could be safely disposed of. According to departmental protocols, tonight, Linda was conducting her monthly inventory of Section C, which contained photographic evidence from cases dating back to the early 1990s. The photographs were stored in acid-free envelopes within climate-controlled filing cabinets, each one labeled with case numbers and dates. That created a chronological catalog of the department's investigative work over the past 3 decades. The process was meticulous and meditative, requiring Linda to examine each photograph to verify its condition and ensure that it remained properly preserved for potential future reference. Most of these images would never be needed again, their evidentiary value having been exhausted during trials that had concluded years ago. but departmental policy required their preservation. Until legal retention periods had been met, Linda pulled the first envelope from Cabinet 7A, which contained crime scene photographs from a burglary investigation that had been concluded in March of 1993. Images showed the interior of a small electronics store that had been broken into during the early morning hours, with merchandise scattered across the floor and display cases that had been smashed by intruders seeking quickly portable items. The photographs had been taken by Detective Ray Martinez, whose careful documentation had captured not just the obvious signs of the break-in, but also subtle details that had eventually led to the identification and arrest of the perpetrators. Linda examined each image with professional appreciation for the skill that crime scene photography required. The ability to translate three-dimensional chaos into two-dimensional evidence that could convey important information to investigators, attorneys, and juries. The first photograph showed the store's front entrance, with its glass door intact, but the security system's control panel hanging open, its wires cut with what appeared to be professional precision. The second image focused on the cash register area, where the drawer had been forced open and emptied of its contents, but where the credit card processing equipment remained untouched, suggesting that the burglars had understood the difference between cash and more complex payment systems. Detective Martinez had documented the methodical way the intruders had worked through the store, taking items that could be easily resold while avoiding merchandise that would be difficult to transport, or that contained security features that might help track their eventual disposal. The photograph showed empty spaces on shelves where small electronics had been removed, but larger appliances and furniture remained untouched. Linda found herself impressed by the thoroughness of the documentation, the way Detective Martinez had captured both overview images that showed the general condition of the store and close-up shots that highlighted specific details that might prove important during the investigation. This comprehensive approach to crime scene photography had been standard practice during that era, when investigators had time to methodically document every aspect of a scene. The case file indicated that the burglary had been solved within 6 weeks, with the arrest of 3 individuals who had been identified through a combination of fingerprint evidence and witness statements from people who had observed suspicious activity in the area during the early morning hours when the break-in had occurred. The resolution had been successful from a law enforcement perspective, but Linda knew that the photographs also documented the impact that crime had on small business owners who lacked the resources to absorb significant losses. The electronics store had eventually closed, not directly because of this burglary, but as part of a gradual decline that had been accelerated by the financial strain of replacing stolen inventory and upgrading security systems. These photographs served as historical documents that captured not just individual crimes, but the broader economic and social context in which they had occurred. The early 1990s had been a challenging period for small retailers, who were facing increased competition from larger chain stores, while also dealing with rising crime rates in urban commercial districts. Linda moved to the next envelope, which contained photographs from a domestic violence investigation that had required particularly sensitive handling due to the serious nature of the injuries involved and the complex family dynamics that had contributed to the situation. The images had been taken by Officer Sandra Chun, who had been specially trained in documenting domestic violence cases with attention to both legal requirements and victim privacy concerns. Photographs showed the interior of an apartment where a violent altercation had taken place, with furniture overturned and personal belongings scattered across the floor. More importantly, they documented the medical evidence of physical assault that had been crucial for prosecution of the case. Images that had been taken with careful attention to maintaining the dignity of the victim while also providing clear documentation of the injuries that had been sustained. Officer Chun's approach to photographing domestic violence scenes had been guided by protocols that recognized the particular vulnerability of victims and the importance of creating evidence that could support prosecution, even if victims later became reluctant to testify. The photographs had been taken with sensitivity to the emotional trauma that domestic violence created, while also meeting the technical standards required for courtroom presentation. The case had been successfully prosecuted, with the defendant receiving a sentence that included both incarceration and mandatory participation in domestic violence intervention programs. The victim had been connected with support services that had helped her develop safety plans and rebuild her life after leaving the abusive relationship. Linda handled these photographs with particular care, understanding that they represented one of the most difficult aspects of police work: the intersection between law enforcement and family crisis intervention. The images documented not just the immediate effects of violence, but the broader social failure that occurred when community support systems were inadequate to prevent domestic abuse. The next envelope contained photographs from a vandalism investigation that had targeted the city's newly installed public art installations. Someone had spray-painted graffiti on several sculptures that had been placed in downtown parks as part of an urban beautification initiative, creating both property damage and community controversy about the appropriate response to the incident. Detective Michael Rodriguez had documented each affected sculpture with photographs that showed both the original artwork and the vandalism that had been added to it. The images revealed that the graffiti had been applied with some artistic skill, suggesting that the vandalism might have been motivated by aesthetic disagreement with the official public art rather than simple destructive impulses. The investigation had revealed complex tensions between different artistic communities in the city, with some local artists feeling excluded from the official public art selection process and expressing their frustration through unauthorized additions to the installed works. The resolution had involved both legal prosecution of the vandalism and broader discussions about community input in public art decisions. The photographs documented interesting case study in the relationship between law enforcement and cultural expression, showing how criminal behavior could sometimes reflect deeper social tensions that required more nuanced responses than simple punishment. The final resolution had included community service that required the vandals to work with official artists on new public art projects that incorporated broader community input. Linda continued her inventory through Cabinet 7A, finding photographs that documented the full range of criminal activity that had come to police attention during that period. Traffic accident investigations were represented by images showing vehicle damage and skid marks that had helped determine fault and contributing factors. Property crimes were documented through photographs of broken windows, forced doors, and missing merchandise that had provided crucial evidence for insurance claims and criminal prosecutions. Each envelope contained not just photographs but glimpses into the daily life of the community during the early 1990s, when social and economic pressures had created particular patterns of criminal activity, and when law enforcement had approached these challenges with the resources and techniques that had been available during that era. One envelope contained photographs from a missing person investigation that had captured regional attention due to the mysterious circumstances surrounding the disappearance of a local college student. 20-year-old Rebecca Morrison had vanished from her apartment near the university campus, leaving behind no indication of where she might have gone or why she might have chosen to disappear. Detective Patricia Williams had documented Rebecca's apartment with photographs that showed no signs of struggle or forced entry, but subtle indications that Rebecca had been preparing for some kind of journey. Her suitcase was missing, along with several changes of clothes and personal items that suggested planned travel. Rather than abduction or accident, the investigation had eventually revealed that Rebecca had been struggling with academic pressures and family expectations that had created overwhelming stress in her life. She had voluntarily left the area to stay with relatives in another state while working through her personal difficulties, but had been afraid to inform her parents directly due to their anticipated reaction to her decision to temporarily leave college. The photographs of Rebecca's apartment had been crucial for ruling out criminal activity while also providing insights into her state of mind that had guided the search efforts. Detective Williams had noted details in the images that suggested Rebecca had been planning her departure carefully, taking items that would be needed for an extended absence while leaving behind things that would not be necessary for a permanent relocation. The case had been resolved successfully with Rebecca's safe return to the community after several months of counseling and family therapy that had addressed the underlying issues that had led to her disappearance. The photographs had served their purpose as investigative tools while also documenting a family crisis that had required patient understanding. Rather than law enforcement action. Linda moved to Cabinet 7B, which contained photographs from the summer of 1993, a period that had been marked by a series of car thefts that had puzzled investigators due to their unusual pattern and apparent lack of financial motivation. The stolen vehicles had been abandoned within days of being taken, usually in good condition, but sometimes with modifications that suggested they had been used for purposes other than simple transportation. Detective Thomas Johnson had documented each recovered vehicle with photographs that showed the condition in which it had been found and any modifications that had been made during the period when it had been stolen. The images revealed that most of the vehicles had been used for what appeared to be recreational driving, with evidence of trips to remote areas and outdoor recreational sites. Investigation had eventually revealed that the thefts were being committed by a group of teenagers who had been using the stolen vehicles for camping and hiking expeditions to areas that were not accessible by public transportation. The young people had been returning the vehicles to easily discoverable locations after their adventures, apparently believing that this approach minimized the harm they were causing to the owners. The resolution had involved both criminal prosecution and community service that had included working with park services to develop legitimate recreational opportunities for young people who lacked access to private vehicles. The photographs had documented not just the criminal activity, but also the underlying social need for youth recreation that had motivated the thefts. These cases from the early 1990s reflected the social and economic tensions that had characterized that period, when communities had been dealing with the effects of economic recession, changing family structures, and evolving social expectations about everything from gender roles to educational opportunities. Linda found photographs from cases involving elderly victims who had been targeted by various financial scams and confidence schemes. Detective Robert Chun had documented these cases with particular attention to the vulnerability factors that had made elderly community members attractive targets for criminals who specialized in exploiting trust and confusion. One set of photographs showed the home of Martha Henderson, an 80-year-old widow who had been convinced by telephone scammers to send money to criminals, claiming to represent a charity for disabled veterans. The images documented Mrs. Henderson's living conditions, which suggested social isolation and limited financial resources that had made her particularly susceptible to emotional manipulation. Detective Chen had approached these cases with understanding that elderly crime victims often suffered emotional trauma that exceeded their financial losses, experiencing feelings of betrayal and self-blame that could have lasting effects on their confidence and social engagement. His investigation had focused not just on identifying and prosecuting the criminals, but also on connecting victims with support services that could help them recover from their experiences. The photographs from these elder abuse cases had been used not just for prosecution, but also for community education programs that helped other elderly residents recognize and avoid similar scams. The images had been sanitized to protect victim privacy while still conveying the emotional and financial impact that such crimes had on vulnerable community members. Linda continued her inventory through Cabinet 7B, finding photographs that documented the evolution of criminal investigation techniques during the early 1990s. Digital photography was still several years away, so all of these images had been captured on film and developed using traditional chemical processes that created physical prints with particular aesthetic characteristics. The film photography of that era had required different skills and techniques than digital imaging, with investigators needing to understand exposure, lighting, and composition in ways that could not be corrected during post-processing. Detective photographers had needed to make technical decisions in real time, without the ability to immediately review and retake images that characterized later digital workflows. The quality of these photographs reflected the professional skill that evidence technicians had developed during the film era, when every shot had to be planned carefully due to the cost and time required for developing and printing. The images had a particular texture and tonal quality that distinguished them from digital photography, creating historical documents that captured not just their subjects, but also the technological context in which they had been created. 1. Envelope contained photographs from a hate crime investigation that had required particularly sensitive handling due to the community tensions it had created. Someone had vandalized the city's synagogue with anti-Semitic graffiti and symbols, creating fear and anger within the Jewish community while also challenging law enforcement to address both the immediate crime and the broader social issues it represented. Detective Sarah Martinez had documented the vandalism with photographs that captured both the specific nature of the graffiti and the broader context of the synagogue's location within a residential neighborhood. The images had been crucial for prosecuting the crime while also serving as evidence of the need for improved community relations and hate crime prevention programs. The investigation had revealed that the vandalism had been committed by young people who had been influenced by extremist materials they had encountered online, at a time when the internet was just beginning to be recognized as a vehicle for spreading hate propaganda. The resolution had involved both criminal prosecution and educational programs designed to help young people understand the historical context and contemporary impact of anti-Semitic violence. The photographs had documented not just the immediate damage to the synagogue, but also the community's response to the incident, including interfaith gatherings and neighborhood watch programs that had been organized to prevent future hate crimes. The images served as historical documentation of how communities could respond constructively to hate-motivated criminal activity. As Linda completed her inventory of Cabinet 7B and moved to Cabinet 7C, she reflected on the historical value of these photographic archives. The images provided not just evidence of individual crimes, but windows into the social and cultural context of law enforcement during the early 1990s, when many current approaches to community policing and restorative justice were still being developed. The photographs documented a period when law enforcement was beginning to recognize the importance of addressing underlying social causes of criminal behavior rather than simply responding to its immediate manifestations. The cases from this era showed investigators working to understand the broader context of criminal activity while also developing more comprehensive approaches to crime prevention and victim assistance. Cabinet 7C contained photographs from cases that had involved juvenile offenders, requiring special attention to privacy protections and confidentiality, requirements that governed the handling of evidence involving minors. The images had been taken with particular care to protect the identities of young people while still providing the documentation necessary for legal proceedings. One set of photographs documented a case involving teenage vandalism at the local high school, where students had damaged property during what appeared to be a spontaneous expression of frustration with school policies and academic pressure. Detective Linda Rodriguez had approached the investigation with understanding that adolescent criminal behavior often reflected developmental challenges rather than malicious intent. The photographs had shown the extent of the damage while also capturing details that suggested the vandalism had been more expressive than destructive, with graffiti that included political and social commentary rather than simple destruction. The investigation had led to restorative justice programs that required the students to work with school administrators to address the underlying issues that had motivated their actions. The resolution had involved both accountability for the property damage and broader discussions about student input in school governance and academic policy. The photographs had documented not just the immediate effects of teenage rebellion, but also a successful example of how law enforcement could work with educational institutions to address youth problems constructively. As dawn approached and Linda prepared to complete her inventory work, she reflected on the privilege of serving as the guardian of these photographic archives. The images represented thousands of hours of investigative work by dedicated professionals who had understood that their careful documentation served not just immediate legal purposes but also the broader goal of understanding and preventing criminal activity. The photographs would continue to rest in their climate-controlled environment, preserved for potential future reference, but also serving as historical documents that captured the evolution of law enforcement techniques and social approaches to criminal justice. In their patient silence, they held the memory of human struggles and triumphs that had shaped the community's ongoing effort to maintain safety and order while respecting individual dignity and rights. The evidence room represented more than just storage for legal materials. It was a repository of collective memory that documented how communities had chosen to respond to the challenges of criminal behavior and social conflict. In the growing light of another day, these images would continue their quiet vigil, preserving the lessons of the past for future generations who would face similar challenges in their own efforts to create just and peaceful communities. Detective James Morrison had been assigned to the cold case unit for 3 years, long enough to understand that his work involved not just revisiting old investigations, but developing a different relationship with time itself. Unlike active cases that demanded immediate attention and rapid resolution, cold cases existed in a suspended state where years or even decades could pass without significant developments, where patience and persistence mattered more than urgency and intensity. This morning, Detective Morrison was reviewing files from cases that had occurred during the summer of 1995, a period that seemed both recent and distant from the perspective of 2002. Cases had been thoroughly investigated when they occurred, but advances in forensic technology and changes in witness circumstances sometimes created new opportunities to solve crimes that had remained mysteries for years. The first file on his desk concerned the disappearance of Michael Chun, a 42-year-old accountant who had vanished from his downtown office building on a Tuesday afternoon in July 1995. Chun had been working late on quarterly reports when security cameras showed him leaving the building at approximately 8:30 p.m., but he had never arrived at his car in the parking garage and had never returned home to his wife and 2 young children. The original investigation had been exhaustive, led by Detective Patricia Rodriguez with assistance from FBI agents who had been called in when the possibility of kidnapping had been considered. Every aspect of Chun's personal and professional life had been examined. from his financial records to his family relationships to his business associations. But no evidence had been found to suggest either criminal activity or voluntary disappearance. Detective Morrison had been working through the Chun file systematically, re-interviewing witnesses whose memories might have been affected by the passage of time, and reviewing physical evidence with the benefit of forensic techniques that had not been available during the original investigation. The case had taken on new urgency due to recent developments in DNA analysis that might provide insights into trace evidence that had been collected but never fully analyzed. The investigation had originally focused on the downtown area where Chun had been last seen, a district that had undergone significant redevelopment since 1995. Many of the buildings that had existed during the time of Chun's disappearance had been demolished or substantially renovated, making it necessary for Detective Morrison to reconstruct the physical environment that had existed 7 years earlier. He had spent considerable time studying architectural plans and construction records, trying to understand how the downtown area had been configured in 1995 and what opportunities might have existed for someone to leave the office building without being detected by security cameras or witnesses. The original investigation had identified several blind spots in the security coverage, areas where someone could have moved without being recorded. One of the most promising leads had involved a construction project that had been underway in the building's parking garage during the summer of 1995. Workers had been installing new electrical systems that had required temporary disruption of some security cameras and lighting systems, creating opportunities for activity that might have gone unnoticed during the period when Chun had disappeared. Detective Morrison had tracked down several construction workers who had been employed on the project, finding that most retained clear memories of the work despite the passage of time. One worker, Carlos Martinez, had mentioned observing unusual activity in the garage during the evening shift when Chun had disappeared, but had not reported it at the time because it had not seemed relevant to his construction responsibilities. Martinez had observed a van with out-of-state license plates parked in an area of the garage that was normally restricted to building tenants. But the significance of this observation had not occurred to him until Detective Morrison had interviewed him about the circumstances of Chun's disappearance. The van had been present for several hours during the evening when Chun had vanished, departing sometime after midnight. This information had led Detective Morrison to examine interstate missing person databases, looking for patterns of disappearances that might be connected to Chun's case. The search had revealed similar cases in 3 other cities, all involving professional men who had disappeared from parking garages under circumstances that suggested careful planning rather than random crime. The investigation had expanded to include federal law enforcement agencies that specialized in interstate crime, with FBI agents working to coordinate information from multiple jurisdictions and develop profiles of potential suspects who might have been operating across state lines during the mid-1990s, while the Chun case remained officially unsolved. The new investigation had provided his family with renewed hope that answers might eventually be found. Detective Morrison had maintained regular contact with Chun's wife, who had remarried several years after her husband's disappearance but continued to seek closure about what had happened during that July evening in 1995. The second file on Detective Morrison's desk involved the murder of Margaret Foster, a 67-year-old librarian who had been found dead in her apartment in September 1995. The case had been initially classified as a burglary gone wrong, with evidence suggesting that Foster had interrupted an intruder who who had then killed her during the struggle that had left the apartment in disarray. Detective Sarah Johnson had led the original investigation, conducting extensive interviews with Foster's neighbors, co-workers, and family members while also processing physical evidence from the apartment. The case had generated significant public attention due to Foster's prominence in the community and the apparently random nature of the crime. The investigation had identified several suspects, including a neighborhood teenager with a history of petty theft and a former library employee who had been terminated for inappropriate behavior. But none of the leads had produced sufficient evidence for prosecution. The case had gradually become inactive as other investigations demanded attention, and new evidence ceased to emerge. Detective Morrison's review of the Foster case had been motivated by advances in fingerprint analysis technology that allowed for more precise comparison of partial prints that had been collected from the apartment. Several prints had been found that could not be matched to Foster, her family members, or other individuals who had legitimate reasons for being in the apartment. The new analysis had identified one partial print that matched records in a national database, connecting to an individual named Robert Patterson, who had been arrested in another state several years after Foster's murder. Patterson had a history of burglary and assault charges that fit the pattern of the Foster case, but he had never been questioned about her death because the connection had not been apparent at the time of his arrests. Detective Morrison had traveled to interview Patterson, who was serving time in a state prison for unrelated crimes. The conversation had been carefully structured to avoid compromising the investigation, while also gathering information about Patterson's whereabouts during September 1995 and his possible connection to the Foster murder. Patterson had initially denied any knowledge of the case, but had eventually acknowledged being in the city during the time period when the murder had occurred. He had claimed to be visiting relatives, but had been unable to provide verifiable details about his activities during the specific dates that were relevant to the investigation. The case had been further complicated by the death of several key witnesses from the original investigation, including neighbors who had reported suspicious activity in Foster's apartment building during the days preceding her murder. Detective Morrison had been working to reconstruct their testimony through police reports and court transcripts, but the loss of first-hand witnesses had created significant challenges for potential prosecution. Despite these obstacles, the Foster case had been reactivated as an active investigation, with prosecutors reviewing the available evidence to determine whether charges could be filed against Patterson based on the fingerprint evidence and other materials that had been collected over the years. The third file involved a series of armed robberies that had occurred during the fall of 1995, targeting small businesses throughout the city's commercial districts. The robberies had followed a consistent pattern, with a single gunman entering stores during closing hours and demanding money from cash registers while avoiding areas where security cameras might record his activities. Detective Michael Rodriguez had coordinated the original investigation, working with business owners to improve security measures, while also analyzing the robbery pattern to predict where the perpetrator might strike next. The investigation had involved extensive surveillance operations and cooperation with other law enforcement agencies that had experienced similar crimes. The robbery series had ended abruptly in November 1995, with no apparent resolution and no arrests, despite the intensive investigation that had been conducted. The sudden cessation of the crimes had suggested either that the perpetrator had been arrested for other offenses or had moved to a different geographic area to continue his criminal activities. Detective Morrison's review of the robbery cases had been prompted by new information from a federal investigation, into organized crime activities that had been active during the mid-1990s. FBI agents had identified connections between various criminal enterprises that had operated across multiple states, including robbery crews that had targeted small businesses in patterns similar to those observed in the 1995 cases. The federal investigation had provided names of individuals who had been involved in interstate crime during that period, including several who had been active in the geographic area where the 1995 robberies had occurred. Detective Morrison had been working to compare the federal information with physical evidence from the robbery scenes, looking for connections that might have been missed during the original investigation. One particular suspect, Anthony Williams, had been identified through the federal investigation as someone who had been operating in the area during 1995 and whose criminal history included armed robberies with characteristics similar to those observed in the local cases. Williams had been killed in an unrelated shooting in 1997, making direct questioning impossible but allowing for DNA comparison with evidence that had been collected during the robbery investigations. The DNA analysis had produced promising results, with partial matches suggesting that Williams might have been involved in several of the 1995 robberies. The evidence was not sufficient for definitive identification, but it provided enough information to close the cases as likely solved, pending any new developments that might emerge from ongoing investigations. Detective Morrison continued his review of 1995 cold cases through the afternoon, working systematically through files that represented thousands of hours of investigative work by officers who had pursued every available lead during their original investigations. The cases reflected the social and economic conditions that had existed during the mid-1990s, when the city had been experiencing both growth and growing pains that had created particular patterns of criminal activity. One file involved the sexual assault of a college student who had been attacked while walking home from her evening job at a campus bookstore. The case had been investigated thoroughly by Detective Linda Chun, who had worked closely with university security and victim services to gather evidence, while also providing support for the traumatized young woman. The original investigation had identified several potential suspects, including individuals with histories of similar crimes and campus employees who had access to areas where the assault had occurred. However, DNA evidence had been limited by the forensic technology available in 1995, and witness identification had been complicated by the poor lighting conditions that had existed at the scene of the attack. Detective Morrison's review had been motivated by advances in DNA analysis that allowed for much more precise comparison of genetic material, even when samples were degraded or limited in quantity. The evidence from the 1995 assault had been reprocessed using current techniques, producing a DNA profile that could be compared against national databases that had expanded significantly since the original investigation. The comparison had produced a match with an individual who had been convicted of similar crimes in other states, providing strong evidence that could support prosecution despite the passage of time. The victim had been contacted and had expressed willingness to cooperate with renewed prosecution efforts, understanding that her case might help prevent similar attacks on other women. The legal proceedings had been complicated by statutes of limitations and other procedural issues that affected older cases, but prosecutors had determined that charges could be filed based on the DNA evidence and other materials that had been preserved from the original investigation. The case represented a successful example of how technological advances could provide justice for victims even years after crimes had been committed. As Detective Morrison continued his work through the cold case files, he reflected on the unique perspective that his assignment provided on the relationship between crime and time. Unlike active investigations that focused on immediate evidence and recent memories, cold cases required understanding how human behavior, physical evidence, and legal procedures evolved over years or decades. The work often involved reconstructing social and physical environments that had changed significantly since the original crimes had occurred. Witnesses had aged, moved away, or died. Buildings had been demolished or renovated. Legal standards and investigative techniques had evolved. Yet within these changes, patterns of human behavior remained consistent, enough to allow skilled investigators to identify connections and develop new insights into old mysteries. Cold case work also required patience with uncertainty and comfort with cases that might never be definitively resolved. Unlike television portrayals that suggested every mystery could be solved through clever detection, real cold case investigation often produced partial answers, probable solutions, and reasonable closure rather than dramatic revelations and perfect justice. Detective Morrison had learned to find satisfaction in providing families with whatever answers were possible, even when complete resolution remained elusive. The passage of time had often allowed people to accept ambiguous outcomes more easily than they could have when grief and trauma were fresh, creating opportunities for healing even when justice remained incomplete. The Cold Case Unit had also provided insights into the evolution of criminal investigation techniques and social approaches to law enforcement. Comparing cases from different eras revealed how understanding of criminal behavior, victim services, and community policing had developed over time, with each generation of investigators building on the work of their predecessors, while also adapting to new challenges and opportunities. As evening approached and Detective Morrison prepared to conclude his work for the day, he organized the files he had been reviewing and updated his case notes with the progress that had been made on each investigation. The work would continue tomorrow and in the days that followed, with each small advancement contributing to the larger goal of providing answers and justice for victims and families who had been waiting years for resolution. The Cold Case Unit represented law enforcement's commitment to never abandoning the search for truth and justice, even when immediate solutions were not apparent. The patient, methodical work of reviewing old evidence and developing new leads demonstrated that the passage of time did not diminish the importance of seeking accountability for criminal behavior or providing closure for those who had been affected by crime. In the quiet of the empty office, surrounded by files that documented years of human tragedy and resilience, Detective Morrison felt the weight of responsibility that came with serving as a guardian of collective memory and a seeker of delayed justice. The work was often frustrating and always challenging, but it provided the satisfaction that came from refusing to accept that some questions would never be answered or some wrongs would never be addressed. The city continued its daily life outside the windows of the Cold Case Unit, but within those walls, the past remained alive and active, demanding attention and care from investigators who understood that time might complicate the search for truth, but could never eliminate the obligation to seek it. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to examine old mysteries, to apply current knowledge to past problems, and to honor the memory of victims by refusing to forget their stories or abandon the hope for justice. Chief Archivist Eleanor Thompson had been the guardian of the final storage vault for over 2 decades, responsible for the cases that had reached the end of their legal journey and could finally be sealed away in the permanent archives. This was where investigations came to rest after all appeals had been exhausted, all questions answered to the extent that human effort could provide answers, and all participants in the drama of justice had moved on to other chapters in their lives. The vault extended deep beneath the government complex, a series of climate-controlled chambers where thousands of case files rested in perfect order, organized by decades and case types in a system that had evolved over the century since the police department's founding. Each file represented not just a completed legal process, but a human story that had found its resolution, whether through conviction, acquittal, civil settlement, or the simple passage of time that had allowed wounds to heal and communities to move forward. Tonight, Eleanor was conducting the quarterly ritual of sealing cases that had reached their statutory retention requirements and could be transferred from active storage to permanent archive status. The process was both administrative and ceremonial, representing the final transition from active investigation to historical record. From urgent legal matter to preserved memory, she began with a group of cases from 1988 that had been waiting 15 years for their final archival processing. The first file contained the complete record of the prosecution of David Martinez for armed robbery, a case that had concluded with his conviction and a 10-year sentence that he had served with distinction, eventually earning early release for good behavior and successful participation in rehabilitation programs. The file documented not just the original crime and its prosecution, but the entire arc of Martinez's journey through the justice system and his eventual reintegration into the community. Letters from prison counselors described his commitment to education and job training programs. Records from parole officers chronicled his steady employment and community service after his release. A final note from the victim, Mrs. Sarah Chun, expressed her forgiveness and her gratitude for Martinez's efforts to make amends for his actions. This case represented the justice system at its most successful, demonstrating how accountability, rehabilitation, and community support could transform both offenders and victims in ways that strengthened, rather than divided, the social fabric. Eleanor handled the file with particular care as she prepared it for permanent storage, understanding that it would serve as an important example for future researchers studying the effectiveness of restorative justice approaches. The second file documented the resolution of a complex embezzlement case involving the misappropriation of funds from a local nonprofit organization. The defendant, Jennifer Rodriguez, had been convicted of stealing over $50,000 from a charity that provided services to homeless families. But the case had been complicated by the discovery that Rodriguez had been using much of the money to provide unauthorized assistance to clients whose needs exceeded the organization's official resources. The legal proceedings had required careful consideration of Rodriguez's motivations and the systemic problems within the social service system that had contributed to her decision to break the law in order to help people she believed were being abandoned by official programs. The resolution had included not just criminal penalties, but also reforms in the nonprofit organization's policies and increased funding for emergency assistance programs. Rodriguez had served 2 years in a minimum security facility while also working with social service agencies to develop more effective approaches to emergency assistance. Her case had led to broader discussions about the relationship between individual conscience and institutional rules, contributing to policy changes that had made legitimate assistance more readily available to people in crisis situations. The file contained letters from families who had received Rodriguez's unauthorized assistance, describing how her actions had prevented evictions, provided emergency medical care, and kept children fed during periods when official resources had been unavailable. These testimonials did not excuse the criminal behavior, but they provided important context for understanding the complex motivations that had driven Rodriguez's actions. Eleanor continued her work through the files, finding case after case that documented the full cycle of crime, prosecution, punishment, and redemption that characterized the most successful outcomes of the justice system. A domestic violence case showed how an abusive husband had been held accountable for his actions, while also receiving the counseling and support services that had eventually allowed him to repair his relationship with his family and become an advocate for other men struggling with anger and control issues. Juvenile case documented the transformation of a teenager who had been involved in gang activity and drug dealing, showing his progression through the juvenile justice system and his eventual success as a community college graduate and youth counselor who worked to prevent other young people from making the mistakes that had nearly derailed his own life. These successful resolutions were balanced by cases that had ended less satisfactorily, files that documented crimes that had been solved and prosecuted, but had left lasting scars on victims and communities that had not healed completely, even with the passage of time. Eleanor understood that not every case could have a redemptive ending, but even these more difficult outcomes provided important lessons about the limits of legal intervention and the ongoing need for community support and healing. 1. File documented a murder case that had been solved through DNA evidence after remaining cold for over a decade. The conviction had provided closure for the victim's family, but the long delay in finding answers had created prolonged suffering that no legal resolution could completely address. The case served as a reminder of the importance of thorough initial investigations and the need for continued improvement in forensic capabilities. Another file contained the record of a financial fraud case that had involved the theft of retirement savings from dozens of elderly victims. While the perpetrator had been convicted and sentenced to significant prison time, most of the stolen money had never been recovered, leaving the victims to face their later years with reduced financial security and damaged trust in the institutions that were supposed to protect their interests. These cases represented the imperfect nature of human justice, the reality that legal processes could provide accountability and deterrence, but could not always restore what had been lost or repair all the damage that had been done. Eleanor had learned over her years of managing these archives that the goal of the justice system was not perfect resolution, but rather the best approximation of fairness and healing that human institutions could provide. As she worked deeper into the archive vault, Eleanor encountered files from earlier decades that documented the evolution of law enforcement and criminal justice approaches over time. Cases from the 1960s and 1970s showed different investigative techniques, different legal standards, and different social attitudes toward crime and punishment that provided historical perspective on how communities had learned to address criminal behavior. One file from 1975 documented the prosecution of a civil rights case involving the harassment of African American families who had moved into a previously all-white neighborhood. The case had been groundbreaking at the time for its recognition that housing discrimination and intimidation tactics constituted federal crimes that required federal prosecution. But reading the file decades later revealed how limited the available legal remedies had been and how much the social context had needed to change before legal equality could become practical reality. The resolution of the case had included criminal convictions for several defendants, but the broader impact had come through the precedent it had established and the community education that had followed. The affected families had eventually been able to live peacefully in the neighborhood, but only after years of legal struggle and community organizing that had gradually changed local attitudes and social norms. Another file from the same era documented a workplace safety case where criminal charges had been filed against corporate executives whose negligence had led to the deaths of construction workers. The case had been unusual for its time in holding individual executives personally responsible for corporate safety violations, establishing precedents that had influenced decades of subsequent workplace safety regulation and enforcement. The legal proceedings had been complex and contentious, with corporate attorneys arguing that accidents were inevitable and dangerous occupations while prosecutors maintained that specific safety violations had created unnecessary risks that had directly caused the workers' deaths. The convictions had been upheld on appeal, but the sentences had been relatively light by contemporary standards, reflecting different attitudes toward corporate accountability that had evolved significantly in subsequent decades. These historical cases provided Eleanor with perspective on how justice had evolved over time, how legal standards and social expectations had changed in response to new understanding of human rights, corporate responsibility, and community welfare. The archive served not just as storage for completed cases, but as a repository of collective learning about how democratic societies could improve their approaches to maintaining order while protecting individual rights and promoting human flourishing. As evening settled over the archive facility, Eleanor moved to the deepest section of the vault, where the oldest cases rested in their permanent storage containers. These files dated back to the early decades of the 20th century, documenting crimes and investigations from an era when law enforcement had operated with very different tools and techniques, but with the same fundamental commitment to protecting community safety and seeking justice for victims. One file from 1923 documented the investigation of a bank robbery that had been solved through old-fashioned detective work, with investigators tracking the suspects across multiple states, using telegraph communications and railway schedules rather than modern forensic techniques. The case had been resolved successfully, with the stolen money recovered and the perpetrators sentenced to lengthy prison terms. But the investigation had required months of painstaking work that would have been completed in days using contemporary technology. The file provided fascinating insights into the social and economic context of the 1920s, when different assumptions about family responsibility, community obligation, and individual rights had shaped both criminal behavior and law enforcement responses. Reading through the careful handwritten reports and formal legal documents, Eleanor could sense the dedication and professionalism of investigators who had pursued justice with the tools and knowledge available to their generation. Another historical file documented a domestic violence case from the 1940s, showing how such situations had been handled during an era when family privacy was considered more important than individual safety, and when legal protections for domestic violence victims were minimal or non-existent. The case had been resolved through informal community pressure and family intervention rather than formal legal action, reflecting social attitudes that had changed dramatically over subsequent decades. These historical cases reminded Eleanor that the pursuit of justice was an ongoing process, with each generation building on the work of their predecessors while also adapting to new challenges and opportunities. The archives documented not just individual cases, but the gradual evolution of democratic societies' approaches to balancing individual rights with community welfare, seeking accountability while promoting rehabilitation, and maintaining order while protecting human dignity. As she completed her archival work for the evening, Eleanor performed the final ritual of sealing the processed cases in their permanent storage containers. Each file was placed in acid-free folders within climate-controlled metal boxes that would preserve the documents for centuries to come. The containers were labeled with case numbers and dates before being placed on shelves in the deepest section of the vault, where they would rest undisturbed unless future researchers needed to access them for historical or legal purposes. The sealed cases represented more than just completed legal proceedings. They were testimonials to the ongoing human effort to create societies where people could live together peacefully despite their differences, where conflicts could be resolved through reason and law rather than through force or arbitrary power, and where victims of crime could receive justice, while offenders could find opportunities for redemption and reintegration. Eleanor reflected on the thousands of cases she had processed during her career, each one representing a human drama that had played out against the backdrop of changing social conditions and evolving legal standards. Some cases had ended with clear victories for justice, while others had concluded with ambiguous outcomes that reflected the complexity of human behavior and the limitations of institutional responses to social problems. Yet taken together, the cases documented remarkable progress in humanity's ongoing effort to create more just and peaceful communities. Legal protections for victims had been strengthened. Investigative techniques had become more sophisticated and more respectful of individual rights. Rehabilitation programs had become more effective at helping offenders change their behavior and reintegrate into society. Community policing approaches had created stronger partnerships between law enforcement and the neighborhoods they served. The archives also documented the persistent challenges that required ongoing attention and innovation. New forms of crime emerged as technology and social conditions changed. Existing legal frameworks sometimes proved inadequate for addressing evolving problems. Resource constraints limited the effectiveness of even well-designed programs and policies. But the overall trajectory documented in these thousands of files was one of gradual improvement, of democratic societies learning to address crime and conflict more effectively while also protecting individual rights and promoting human dignity. The archives served as both a record of past achievements and a foundation for future progress, preserving the lessons that had been learned through generations of experience with the challenges of maintaining justice in complex human communities. As Eleanor prepared to leave the archive vault, she performed one final check of the environmental controls and security systems that protected these precious records. The temperature and humidity were maintained within precise ranges that would prevent deterioration of the documents. Motion sensors and alarm systems would detect any unauthorized access to the facility. Fire suppression systems would protect the archives from the most serious threat to their preservation. In the growing silence of the empty facility, Eleanor felt the weight of responsibility that came with serving as the guardian of this collective memory. The cases that rested in these climate-controlled chambers represented the covet dedication of thousands of law enforcement officers, prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, and other professionals who had committed their careers to the pursuit of justice. More importantly, they represented the experiences of countless victims, defendants, witnesses, and community members who had been touched by crime and had participated in the often difficult process of seeking truth and accountability through legal institutions. Their stories deserve to be preserved with care and dignity, held in trust for future generations who would face similar challenges in their own efforts to create just and peaceful societies. The archive vault would continue its patient vigil through the night and in all the nights to come, protecting these records from the passage of time and the forgetfulness that could erase the lessons they contained. In their sealed containers, the cases rested in the perfect quiet of completed stories, their dramas resolved, their lessons learned, their participants released to continue their lives with whatever healing and wisdom they had gained from their encounters with the justice system. Outside the vault, the city continued its restless movement, generating new stories that would eventually find their way into police reports, court proceedings, and ultimately into these same archives where they would join the vast collection of human experience that documented the ongoing effort to maintain civilization in an imperfect world. But in the deepest chambers of the archive vault, surrounded by thousands of sealed cases that had found their rest, Eleanor felt the profound peace that comes from work completed, stories resolved, and justice served to the best of human ability. The cases would sleep here undisturbed, holding their secrets in the eternal silence of memory preserved, waiting in the patient darkness for whatever future need might call them back to light. In this final quiet, where all the urgent voices had been stilled and all the complex dramas had found their endings, the archives held their vigil over the community's commitment to justice, serving as both monument to past achievements and foundation for future progress in humanity's endless effort to live together in peace, order, and mutual respect. Retired Detective Captain Sarah Martinez sat on the front porch of her small house in the Riverside district. the same neighborhood where she had walked beats as a young officer 35 years earlier. The evening air carried the familiar. Sounds of families settling in for the night, children being called inside, porch lights beginning to glow in the gathering dusk. At 72, she had become part of the neighborhood's living memory, one of the few people who could remember how these streets had looked and felt. During decades of gradual change and quiet healing, the house across the street had been the site of her first domestic disturbance call in 1968, when she had been a rookie officer trying to understand how law enforcement could help families in crisis without making their problems worse. Tonight, the same house glowed with warm light from windows where the Rodriguez family was sharing dinner. 3 generations gathered around a table in a scene of ordinary contentment that represented the best possible outcome of community policing done with patience and care. Sarah had stayed in touch with many of the families she had encountered during her career, not in any official capacity, but as a neighbor who had shared significant moments in their lives. The Morrison family on Elm Street still sent her Christmas cards, including updates about their son Michael, who had grown from a troubled teenager into a successful teacher and father. The Chun family invited her to graduation parties and wedding celebrations, treating her as an honorary aunt who had been present during some of their most difficult and important moments. This informal network of relationships represented one of the most rewarding aspects of community policing that rarely appeared in official reports or policy discussions. Officers who stayed in the same neighborhoods long enough could watch families grow and heal, could see how patient intervention during crisis periods had contributed to positive outcomes that unfolded over years or decades. Sarah had been privileged to witness these long-term stories of recovery and resilience that gave deeper meaning to the daily work of law enforcement. Tonight, she was expecting a visit from Detective James Kim, her former partner's son, who had recently been promoted to the cold case unit and was seeking advice about approaching investigations that stretched across multiple decades. Sarah had agreed to share her memories and insights, understanding that institutional knowledge was often passed down through informal, mentoring relationships rather than through formal training programs. Detective Kim arrived as the streetlights were beginning to flicker on, carrying a folder of case files that represented some of the department's most persistent unsolved mysteries. He settled into the second rocking chair that Sarah kept on, her porch for exactly these kinds of conversations, where experience could be shared in the relaxed atmosphere that encouraged honest reflection about the complexities of police work. Asterisk, the first case that Kim wanted to discuss involved a series of break-ins that had occurred during the early 1970s, targeting homes in affluent neighborhoods with a precision that suggested inside knowledge of the family's schedules and security arrangements. The crimes had stopped abruptly after several months, with no arrests and no clear resolution. But Kim had been reviewing the files as part of an effort to determine whether advances in forensic technology might provide new investigative opportunities. Sarah remembered the case well, having been involved in the neighborhood canvass operations that had been conducted after each break-in. The investigation had been thorough, but had been hampered by the limited forensic capabilities and communication technologies that had been available during that era. More significantly, the investigation had been complicated by the social dynamics of the affected neighborhood, where residents had been reluctant to share information that might reflect poorly on their friends and neighbors. The resolution had come through community pressure rather than formal law enforcement, Sarah explained. The break-ins had been committed by the teenage son of a prominent local family, acting out his resentment toward his parents and their social circle through carefully planned property crimes that had embarrassed the victims more than they had enriched him. The family had eventually arranged for private restitution and therapy for their son, while the police department had quietly closed the cases without formal prosecution. This type of informal resolution had been more common during earlier eras of policing. When communities had been smaller and more cohesive, and when social institutions had been capable of providing accountability and rehabilitation without formal legal proceedings. Sarah suggested that Kim consider whether similar dynamics might explain other unsolved cases from that period, where community solutions might have preempted the need for continued investigation. The second case involved a missing person from 1985, a college student who had disappeared during spring break and had never been found. Despite extensive searches and investigations, Kim had been re-examining the case with particular attention to new information that had emerged about serial predators who had been active during the 1980s, wondering whether the disappearance might be connected to broader patterns of criminal activity. Sarah had been involved in the original investigation as a detective, and she shared her memories of the victim's family and the community response to the disappearance. The case had received significant media attention and had prompted changes in campus, safety policies, and student travel recommendations. But the lack of resolution had left lasting wounds that had affected not just the immediate family, but the entire university community. The investigation had been hindered by jurisdictional issues and limited coordination between different law enforcement agencies, Sarah explained. The student had disappeared while traveling through multiple states, creating complications about which agency had primary responsibility for the investigation and how information should be shared between different departments. These coordination problems had been gradually resolved through improved interstate communication systems and federal initiatives, but the improvements had come too late to benefit the original investigation. Sarah suggested that Kim focus on re-examining physical evidence using current forensic techniques, but also recommended that he approach the family with sensitivity to the possibility that they might prefer to maintain their privacy rather than reopening old wounds. The passage of time had allowed some families to find peace with unresolved cases, and investigators needed to balance their professional obligations with respect for victims, families who had built new lives around their losses. As their conversation continued into the evening, Kim shared other cases that had been challenging him, while Sarah provided historical context and practical insights based on her decades of experience. The informal mentoring session represented the kind of knowledge transfer that was essential for maintaining institutional memory and ensuring that lessons learned through experience were passed on to new generations of investigators. The conversation was interrupted by neighbors who stopped to greet Sarah and check on how she was doing, illustrating the web of relationships that she had developed during her years of community policing. Mrs. Patterson from the corner house brought fresh cookies and updates about her grandchildren. Mr. Johnson from across the street shared news about neighborhood improvements that were being planned by the city council. These interactions demonstrated the ongoing connections between law enforcement and community life that extended far beyond official duties and responsibilities. After the neighbors had continued on their evening walks, Kim asked Sarah about her perspective on how policing had changed during her career and what advice she would offer to officers who were just beginning their careers. Her response reflected the wisdom that came from observing law enforcement from multiple perspectives over several decades. The most important change, Sarah suggested, had been the gradual recognition that effective policing required understanding communities rather than simply patrolling them. Officers who took time to learn about the families, businesses, and organizations in their assigned areas could provide more effective service because they understood the social context in which problems occurred and could identify resources for addressing underlying causes rather than just immediate symptoms. Technology had certainly improved investigative capabilities, but Sarah emphasized that the fundamental skills of police work remained unchanged: listening carefully, observing accurately, communicating clearly, and treating people with dignity and respect regardless of their circumstances. These human skills could not be replaced by technological advances, and remained the foundation of effective law enforcement. Sarah also stressed the importance of patience and persistence in police work, qualities that were sometimes undervalued in contemporary emphasis on rapid response and quick resolution. Many of the most significant cases she had worked had required months or years of careful investigation, with breakthroughs coming through gradual accumulation of information rather than dramatic discoveries. Officers needed to understand that meaningful results often required sustained effort over extended periods. As the evening progressed, Kim shared his own observations about the challenges facing current law enforcement, including resource constraints, changing social expectations, and the complexity of modern criminal activity. Sarah listened with the understanding that each generation of officers faced unique challenges while also dealing with persistent, human problems that had remained constant throughout history. The conversation gradually shifted from specific cases to broader reflections about the role of law enforcement in democratic society and the responsibility that came with the authority to investigate crimes and arrest suspects. Sarah emphasized that police officers served as guardians of constitutional rights rather than simply enforcers of laws, with special obligations to protect vulnerable community members and ensure that justice was administered fairly regardless of people's social or economic status. These responsibilities had become more complex over time, Sarah noted, as communities had become more diverse and as awareness of historical injustices had created new expectations for police accountability and transparency. Officers needed to approach their work with humility and recognition that law enforcement was just one component of the larger social systems that communities use to address problems and maintain order. The evening concluded with Kim expressing gratitude for Sarah's insights and requesting permission to contact her again when other challenging cases required historical perspective or community context. Sarah welcomed the opportunity to continue contributing to law enforcement even in retirement, understanding that her experience represented a valuable resource that should be shared with officers who were carrying forward the work she had begun decades earlier. After Kim departed, Sarah remained on her porch for a while longer, enjoying the peaceful quiet that had settled over the neighborhood. The streets that had once been the scene of various crimes and conflicts had evolved into a stable, residential community where families felt safe and where problems were addressed through cooperation rather than confrontation. The transformation had not happened accidentally or automatically, but through the patient work of many people over many years. Police officers who had taken time to understand community needs, residents who had been willing to work with law enforcement rather than against it, social service providers who had addressed underlying problems, and local officials who had supported community-oriented approaches to public safety. Sarah's own career had spanned a period of significant change in law enforcement philosophy and practice, from the more traditional approaches of the 1960s through the community policing innovations of later decades. She had been privileged to participate in this evolution and to see how thoughtful changes in police procedures could improve both public safety and police-community relations. The neighborhood around her represented the best possible outcome of this evolution, a community where law enforcement and residents worked together to maintain conditions that supported family life and economic opportunity. The crimes that had once troubled these streets had been replaced by the ordinary challenges of democratic community life, disagreements that could be resolved through discussion, problems that could be addressed through cooperation, and conflicts that could be handled through established institutions rather than through force or intimidation. As Sarah finally prepared to go inside for the evening, she reflected on the thousands of cases that had passed through her hands during her career and the many lives that had been touched by her work as a police officer. Some cases had ended with clear victories for justice, while others had concluded with ambiguous outcomes that reflected the complexity of human behavior and the limitations of legal institutions. But taken together, The cases had contributed to the gradual improvement of community life, the strengthening of social institutions, and the development of more effective approaches to maintaining public safety while protecting individual rights. Sarah felt privileged to have been part of this larger effort and satisfied that her work had made a positive difference in the lives of people she had served. The porch light continued to glow as Sarah went inside, creating a welcoming beacon that symbolized the ongoing presence of law enforcement in the community. Not as an occupying force, but as neighbors who had chosen to dedicate their careers to serving and protecting the people who shared their streets. Their concerns and their hopes for peaceful community life died in the gentle darkness that surrounded the house. The neighborhood settled into its nightly rhythm of rest and restoration, secure in the knowledge that its safety was protected by institutions and individuals who understood that effective law enforcement was ultimately about creating conditions where all community members could flourish and where democratic values could be expressed through daily life rather than just through formal political processes. The stories that crime Stories for Sleep had told through 9 volumes of cases and investigations had found their ultimate expression here, in a peaceful residential neighborhood where former crimes had been transformed into lessons learned, where past conflicts had been resolved into current cooperation, and where the work of law enforcement had contributed to the larger human project of creating communities where people could live together in safety, dignity, and mutual respect. In this quiet conclusion, all the urgent voices had finally been stilled. All the complex investigations had found their resolution, and all the human dramas had settled into the eternal rhythm of ordinary life continuing, watched over by those who had dedicated their lives to ensuring that such peace was possible, and that such communities could endure.